This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. Oh, and we're back with another action-packed, horrific, abysmal, dark episode of Art of Darkness. And I am Kevin Kautzman here in snowy St. Paul, Minnesota, joined by my partner in crime, fellow podcast cultist, Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good, man. I have gone down past the unspeakable eldritch terror of the past few weeks of research, and I'm ready to again, encounter other human beings for a little while. So I'm pretty good. I'm pretty excited about that.
Okay. All right. Well, we have another human being here with us as well. Do you want to
do.
make the introduction to our special guest?
Yeah. So we've got a good friend of mine, Ben Thomas. Ben is the mastermind and editor behind House Blackwood, most notable for the Willows Anthology, which collects the best of the Willows magazine, which, Ben, I don't think you're running the Willows magazine anymore. Is that right?
Right. The magazine is discontinued. The anthology is available as a hardback. And of course, we also put out Tales from Omnipark last year, a collection of stories set in a theme park that might have been, which includes fiction by Brad Kelly, as well as various other people.
And Brian Evanson and Gemma Files and yourself, Ben Thomas. It's a fun little project. Not a little project. It's fun. It's a big project, but it's definitely fun, worth checking out. Ben is also the author of The Sword in the Cradle.
Cradle and the Sword.
Yeah. Oh, did I get that wrong? No.
It's The Cradle and the Sword, but yeah, that's
even better. That's a better title. Yeah.
It's a historical fiction novel, sort of loosely based on Dune. Tracks 5,000 years of history in ancient Mesopotamia. Cradle and the Sword could be worth checking out.
That's based.
All right,
yeah, that's
nice.
Excellent.
Ben, where can people find all this stuff? Just hang on.
Amazon.
Yeah. Oh, at Amazon.
Yeah,
Okay.
You can get most of it on Amazon. The Willows is a special printing by a press here in Austin, Texas, where I live. But you can go, if you go to houseblackwood.net, you can find everything there.
Beautiful.
Also, Ben runs the Strange Continent. Tell us a little bit about Strange Continent.
I do a lot of things. Yeah,
you do a lot of things, man.
I run the blog, The Strange Continent, which is a blog about really the history and the culture of cultures that tend not to be documented as much, especially by people here in the West. So nomadic cultures of Central Asia, ancient Persia, the Scythians, the steppe tribes, Central African civilizations from ancient history, just the stuff, all of the history that when you were in school and you heard about what was going on in certain parts of the world. If you ever wondered what was going on at that time in all the rest of everywhere, that's what the Strange Continent is about.
So,
very, very cool.
Right,
very cool.
right. Well, and it sounds like Ben might be uniquely positioned to help us handle our subject today. Who, Brad?
Hp Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft.
Gasp!
Yeah,
and he fainted into his chair. This is
the big one, guys. This is the granddaddy.
This is a granddaddy episode. I can hear my fainting sound there. Woo! I'm falling back into my what do you call it? Like a fainting couch,
right?
This is a big one.
It is a big one. And we'll get right into it, I suppose. But Kevin, classic Art of Darkness opening question. What do you know about Hp Lovecraft?
I've been thinking about this a little bit today, and I do try to keep these answers brief. This one is probably going to be a little longer than normal, if only because Lovecraft has such a footprint on the culture. But in this rather
eldritch and unspeakable way.
Yeah, this sort of sinister, strange way. It's like the thing is a metaphor for itself, right? Most recently, I watched what I think is probably the greatest piece of art that exists inside the Lovecraftian universe, which of course is True Detective Season 1. In that maybe I'm offending Ben. Ben, please.
No, quite the opposite. True Detective Season 1 is bae. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, you were smacking your lips. I couldn't tell if you're like a purist who's like, oh no, Evil Dead over everything.
Oh no. But, later in this episode, we'll get into how everything from John Carpenter's The Thing, Alien, his influence. You're absolutely right. It's everywhere.
And you're jumping into kind of what I was going to say, which is that it's in everything. You sometimes have to know how to look, right? So True Detective Season 1 lives within The King in Yellow. The King in Yellow was it Robert Bloch, who sort of wrote within this tradition, this school. I think I was corrected, and I hate being corrected, but I think I was corrected for mistakenly associating Lovecraft with Baltimore, when in fact that he's from Rhode Island. So I had that correction. I know because of sort of the darker side of Twitter that his cat had an unfortunate name, which maybe we won't mention. But I just know that because of Twitter. Thank you, Twitter. The hell. I mean, Lovecraft could never have imagined the horror that is the Bird website. I don't think he would have lasted 1 week. But yeah, and of course you can find us at Art of Dark Pod on Twitter, and then of course patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. But getting into it, I did read a lot of Lovecraft when I was a teenager. I probably shouldn't have, but I did. I think like so many.
Explains a lot.
You're looking for the strange and the sort of, it has that quality of kind of, there's a dirtiness to it, or kind of like a mustiness. Like it's like the way they sell this to sort of young men and to sort of teenage boys, there's like an edge to it. But then also the prose is very strong. It tends to be epistolary. So it's always somebody's writing a letter and going mad.
Right.
Which
it's pretty
kind of fun.
Yeah, and it sometimes has that like, and here they come up the steps, kind of like, it doesn't quite do that, but like there's
another thing about his work, and I am going to go on a little bit here.
That's all right.
Another thing about his work is that it's not entirely clear what the hell is going on a lot of the time because of the quality of madness, but also like in the work itself, it's sort of hard to get a read on, okay, well, this is a novella and this is a short story, and how does this fit into, is this all happening in the same universe? It's a vibe for sure. And then beyond this, it's just that like, you can't overstate his influence on people, on the arts, and sort of even now there's just always some new media product that is directly, I mean, they even have the show Lovecraft Country, don't they? Now, and tabletop role playing, it was part of all that funky, fun counterculture. I mean, hell, even Metallica have the instrumental song. Is it on the end of Ride the Lightning? Is it Call of Cthulhu?
Oh, do they really?
And there's another one called The Thing That Should Not Be. Very Lovecraftian title.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
and in fact, there was a band called Hp Lovecraft actually in the 60s. So
there you go. So it's just, it's like nerds. We're definitely in like nerd territory, but there's enough of an edge and a weirdness. And that is what I know about Hp Lovecraft.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I dig that. I want to start, I'm always thinking about how to structure these and getting into the life and work of Lovecraft. The Cthulhu mythos universe, if any subject we've covered so far has had something that was bigger than them, it's this. Like, in terms of what they created is way larger than they were. And so I kind of want to start there and kind of throw it to Ben. And Ben, can you just give us, at whatever kind of level of resolution you think is appropriate, what is the Cthulhu mythos?
Yeah.
When I say that, what's that mean?
Yeah, this is, I think, what you've just prefaced it with is perfect, Brad. It's so much larger than Lovecraft himself. It's some other writers, including Alan Moore, who wrote, of course, The Watchmen and various other graphic novels. Alan Moore was a huge Lovecraft fan and said that Lovecraft, more than anything else, seemed to be like a person who was trying to perpetrate an incredibly elaborate hoax rather than writing a fictional world. So it's not just Cthulhu, the monster Cthulhu that we're all, of course, familiar with today. It's an entire mythological world. It's cities like Arkham, Massachusetts. It's Miskatonic University. It's books like the Necronomicon, and there's a whole other list of them that we'll go into later in the episode. It's surprisingly not really human characters, by and large. Lovecraft was a big aficionado of Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, of course. But unlike Arthur Conan Doyle, doesn't really have any protagonists or plot points that recur through multiple stories. You can kind of read them in any order. But that said, they are almost all set in New England, in a lot of them in rural New England, and or in very esoteric parts of the world, the heart of the Rub al-Khali, the Arabian desert, or some desolate place in the Australian outback, or the heart of Antarctica, or some place like that. And what Lovecraft's, I guess I would say, part of the uniqueness of what makes it a Lovecraft mood, in the same way that Kafkaesque is a mood, is that it's bringing all of these things together. It's like Lovecraft is the only person who I can think of who could write a horror story that brings together like Einsteinian space-time physics, Antarctic archaeology, human sacrifice cults from ancient history, monsters from beyond the stars, invertebrate physiology, and the world of dreams and the Jungian subconscious, and somehow weaves these all together into a single narrative thread. And the thread is humanity is doomed, basically. We're totally screwed. Aliens are coming. Alien gods are coming to eat us, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Right. Boom.
No lie detected, bro.
That's wonderful. So we're gonna find Lovecraft in there and find that in Lovecraft and the whole shebang. I want to go right from that. And what's funny is I've read The Watchmen and I didn't even realize until you said that the monster that is unleashed near the end of Watchmen is clearly a Lovecraftian monster.
Absolutely.
I don't know how I didn't make that connection.
Alan Moore is a huge Lovecraft fan. He actually wrote a cycle of graphic novels, the best of which I think is called Providence, named after Lovecraft's hometown, which Lovecraft is actually a character in. Highly recommended, required reading Providence for anybody who likes Lovecraft. Also, Neil Gaiman, massively influenced by Lovecraft. Grant Morrison, massively influenced by Lovecraft. I mean, we'll get into it as we go through. But if anywhere in any of the speculative literary fields, he's just ubiquitous.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to go from there. I've got a segue right to the time when Lovecraft is a child, right? So we see this world, and now I'm going to read a little bit from Lovecraft wrote at least 100,000, probably many more letters to people. It's probably why he wasn't quite as prolific. He could have been a more prolific writer of fiction if he hadn't have written, 250,000 letters in his life or whatever it was. Okay, so but here's one. And he's talking to a friend of his in this letter. When I was 6 or 7, I used to be tormented constantly with a peculiar type of recurrent nightmare in which a monstrous race of entities, called by me night gaunts, I don't know where I got hold of the name, used to snatch me up by the stomach and carry me off through infinite leagues of black air over the towers of dead and horrible cities. They would finally get me into a gray void where I could see the needle-like pinnacles of enormous mountains miles below. Then they would let me drop, and as I gained momentum in my Icarus-like plunge, I would start awake in such a panic that I hated to think of sleeping again. The night gaunts were black, lean, rubbery things with horns, barbed tails, bat wings, and no faces at all. Undoubtedly, I derived the image from the jumbled memory of Doré drawings, Gustave Doré, which fascinated me in waking hours. They had no voices, and their only form of real torture was their habit of tickling my stomach before snatching me up and swooping away with me. I somehow had the vague notion that they lived in the black burrows honeycombing the pinnacle of some incredibly high mountain somewhere. They seemed to come in flocks of 25 or 50 and would sometimes fling me one to the other. Night after night, I dreamed the same horror with only minor variants, but I never struck those hideous mountain peaks before waking. So, so
You know,
that's
two things. One, I stand by what I said. He wouldn't last a week on Twitter. Two, of course, it's a joke. Wow, he's got no chill. The second thing is, I'm sure we have drugs to handle this now.
Well, yeah, that's a possibility.
And just really want to underline that 6-year-old Lovecraft dreaming of being tickle tortured by creatures made of black latex. Just really want to underline that.
Right. Seal that in for sure.
Gentlemen, may I ask a question? Does that not trigger some memory of nightmares or night terrors you may have had as children?
I had a nightmare a few times about a wolf attacking me and pouncing on me and tearing my stomach open.
Oof.
Like a monstrous, 3 times the size of a wolf.
And it stays with you when you have a memory like that. I remember a dream I had where I had to jump from tombstone to tombstone in order to avoid falling into the pit of a graveyard. I mean, that haunted me for years. But the ability to write it so well. What about you, Ben? Anything like that?
Yeah, he and by the way, Lovecraft often would write stories in a fugue state between dreams and waking later in his life, by the way. Well, he sort of like, if you remember the stories about Salvador Dali, the way that he would fall asleep with a fork in his hand and drop it and then wake up and paint what he was dreaming. Right. Lovecraft would have techniques like that. He would wake up and sort of not fully awake, transcribe what he was dreaming sort of as he's still dreaming it. So this is profound influence on his writing technique.
That is
for me. Mm-hmm. For me personally, my childhood recurring nightmare was always that I was going into an aquarium store, like a fish store, and as I go deeper and deeper into the story, it gets darker and darker, and the creatures in the tanks get stranger and stranger until they're like these weird, like multi-headed, multi-part invertebrate things, and they start coming out of the tanks and trying to get me, and then that's usually like where the climax of the nightmare is. So very, very Lovecraftian for me from the start.
Wow. Well, I want to ask one more question, which is, Brad, we always do a Patreon episode for the Patreon subscribers after dark. And what are we going to do today for Lovecraft, just to get ahead of that? I want to tease that.
So we're going to talk about some reading that I've done, came across in the research. We're going to start to speculate, and it's grounded in some things that other people have uncovered about whether Cthulhu was real.
So if you want to hear that, you got to subscribe after the core episode.
Yeah, we're going deep. We're going deep into the lore.
Art of Dark Pod. All right. That was a great reading, by the way, Brad. Go on.
Thank you. So I want to pair that with something else about his mother. Okay. And then we're going to get into kind of typical biographical stuff. Okay. So we had that from the Night Gaunt's dreams when he was 6 or 7. Now here's something about his mother, as relayed by a neighbor much, much later. This neighbor says, I remember the aunts who came to the little house on Angel Street often, as I recollect. That's Lovecraft's aunts. Quiet, determined little New England women, quite different from Mrs. Lovecraft. That's our Lovecraft's mom. Although Mrs. Lovecraft was a very determined person herself. I remember Mrs. Lovecraft spoke to me about weird and fantastic creatures that rushed out from behind buildings and from corners at dark, and that she shivered and looked about apprehensively as she told her story. So Lovecraft's mother, we'll get to it, she had some demons as well, okay? And we're going to kind of get into the meat of it now because his upbringing is very interesting. And as we've seen with a lot of our subjects, once you kind of start to piece it together, it almost makes sense that they produced the work that they produced. It's not surprising in a lot of ways. So started her at the beginning. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Hp Lovecraft, was born on August 20th, 1890, Providence, Rhode Island, as we said. The only child of Winfield Scott Lovecraft. I love these names. Sarah
they all sound like packs of cigarettes.
You could definitely see like a pack of Lovecrafts. Yeah, for sure. Or Winfields.
Winfields. Smooth and satisfying.
Right. So, and his mother was named Sarah Susan Phillips, often called Susie. The Phillips family, her side, was pretty well to do, and Lovecraft would kind of use this as a means to sort of assume a long line of like gentlemanly respectability, right? He liked to there's an aspect of him, there's not, a little bit of truth to it, I suppose, but he wants to be part of one of the old families, he wants to be kind of part of that. Most of the money comes from within the Phillips family, comes from Lovecraft's maternal grandfather, which is an even better name than anybody else's in here, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, which is so good.
Whipple Van Buren Phillips, and he looks exactly the way that you would picture a 19th century man named Whipple Van Buren Phillips would look. It's what you're picturing, it's that.
And what I love about it, Whipple isn't a nickname. Whipple is, right. He was born, his mother wrote down Whipple on the form. I love it. He was one of these men of that era who, I guess of our era too, but who had a number of business ventures, and a lot of them went well, and some of them didn't, and all of that.
I think a name like Whipple is a bit of a life hack for the period, because they love to give you nicknames.
Right.
Back then, this was during a time when bullying was alive and well, and if you just give your son the name Whipple, it's a boy named Sue territory.
It is, The nickname's built in, right? It's
come and get me.
Yeah, come and get me. My name's Whipple. So one thing is important here too. While I'm kind of sketching out the family, Susie had a couple of sisters, the Lovecraft aunts, who feature very prominently in HP's life. Anyways, Susie gets married to this man named Winfield Scott. They lived together for a while in the suburbs of Boston when Winfield, HP Lovecraft's father, has a mental breakdown and is institutionalized, sending Susie and her 2-year-old son, Howard, back to Providence to rely on the largesse of her father, right? So they basically move. Dad loses his mind, syphilis most likely, and Susie and HP move back into her father's house, which luckily is this huge 3-story mansion with a library of 2,000 books, and like stables and all of these crazy things, right? So HP kind of lives privileged childhood. But it's also kind of a house on the decline. Go ahead.
That's tough, though, because that reminds me of Anna Kavan, where, you come from a ton of money, previous episode, Anna Kavan, but your father kills himself, or your father goes mad. There are these tragedies in life that no amount of money will spare you.
Right. No, absolutely. And his father goes into this institution and he never comes out. Right. That's it.
Whoa.
That's it.
Oh, wow.
So, he dies sometime later, but he never really comes out of the institution.
Oof.
And that's when Lovecraft is 2 years old. So, and I'll give you kind of a quick rundown because it's a little bit haunting. And you can imagine if this story was part of your personal biography, it's kind of haunting. He's on Winfield, HP's father. He's on a business trip in Chicago, and he's alone in a hotel room, and he starts crying out that the chambermaid has insulted him, and that his wife, who's not on the trip, is being assaulted on a floor above him, and that he can't get to her, right? Mm-hmm. And then his hallucinations are so intense they have to restrain him, and he gets sort of power of attorney signed over to the family lawyer, and they put him in a mental institution again. Never comes out. Now, as we said before, with that little bit about Susie seeing, let's call them night gaunts, whatever, she's not particularly more stable than he is, really. She's a little bit more stable, maybe. But with Winfield gone and Susie a little teetery, this relationship between Susie and HP is very, it's not be polite about it. It's not the ideal conditions for a young man, I would say. We're talking about the devouring. This is like prime devouring mother, like Freud having a field day. Right. He would say nothing but nice things. Well, not nothing. He would say almost nothing but nice things about her. You know, she had a great singing voice. Her piano playing was wonderful. She was a good painter and she could speak French. But she clearly became obsessed with the fact that HP was all that she had left. Right. Lost her husband. She never remarried. You know, she was dependent on her father to raise Howard, and the aunts were around and that kind of thing. Now, I want to give you a little bit of a reading about how intense. This is again from the Camp biography. I recognize that there's this biography I'm going from, the Lovecraft by L. Sprague de Camp. There's some detractors out there in the world, so we'll kind of just put everything a little bit in scare quotes. But I think for the most part, it's reliable enough for us to kind of tell the story. And Ben, if I say something out of this bio that you're like, that is totally wrong, you just, you know, tap me with a little ruler.
De Camp is I would say is the definitive Lovecraft bio. I recommended it. So
okay, yeah, no, you did, and I did some research and it was like, there's some other stuff, but a lot of it seemed kind of. There's a lot when you get a figure like this, like Lovecraft. There's a lot of people who tried to do biographies, and to really do a biography, you got to dig into the archives and you got to talk to people, and you got to,
Lovecraft.
Oh, go ahead.
Go on.
With Lovecraft, the difficulty is that first of all, like as we've mentioned, the sheer amount of documentation is just enormous. He has 100,000 plus personal letters that his family kept and his friends, and also the fact that trying to assemble a psychological picture of H.P. Lovecraft, as we're going to see, is like trying to assemble a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle where every piece in the box looks like it came from a different puzzle. He's a very hard person to fit together psychologically.
He is.
So that's going to be a challenge as we go through. But
and we're going to kind of paint brush strokes around the edge and see what we get, I think. So one thing, so I'm going to read this. This is the level of coddling and devouring mother sort of situation. On their summer vacations at Dudley, Massachusetts, Mrs. Lovecraft refused to eat her dinner in the dining room, not to leave her sleeping son alone for an hour on the floor above. When a teacher friend, Miss Sweeney, took the rather rangy youngster for a walk, holding his hand, she was enjoined by Howard's mother to stoop a little, lest she pull the boy's arm from its socket. When Howard pedaled his tricycle along Angel Street, his mother trooped beside him, a guarding hand upon his shoulder. This vigilance increased rather than relaxed the older Howard grew. So she had that mother hen devouring mother sort of influence on him, and his aunts were only slightly better in this regard, though they did kind of let him grow up a little bit more than she did. Susie would let him eat whatever he wanted to eat, so he never, and this probably didn't help him. He had a rapacious appetite for sweets, never really ate any vegetables. He was absolutely disgusted by seafood, which I think is interesting. In the case of Lovecraft, and not for most people, whatever, you're into seafood or you're not. She also, in her wish to have a girl, would constantly emphasize his feminine attributes, his curly hair that she let grow out until he was, sort of forced him to grow out until he was 6. There were even times when he was very young that Lovecraft would say that he was a girl. Mostly because Susie was sort of, indoctrinating him in this way. But then at the same time, she showed him basically zero physical intimacy. So she wasn't like hugging him and giving him a little pat on the head, giving him a little kiss, giving him encouragement, that kind of thing. So on the one hand, you get this like clamped down, I guess you could call it love, but it's this pathological kind of control thing. And on the other, you're not giving any of the positive aspects that might come out of that sort of thing.
Wow, this sounds like a recipe for Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs here. It really does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Just to expand a little bit on some of the things Brad said, his mother would actually dress him sometimes in girls' dresses and petticoats and would refer to him as her little girl. And later in adolescence would actually begin to tell other people that he was too ugly to appear in public and would tell him that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just to highlight that even more.
Yeah. And even when he was like a little bit later in life, when he was a kind of reclusive, like adolescence and things, and adolescent, she would tell people that the reason he didn't leave the house was because he was so hideous and he was ashamed of people seeing him.
Oh man.
So that became, it becomes part of the narrative. And later on, when he has the one romantic relationship of his life, which we'll talk about, he tries talking to this woman and basically says, I can't understand how anybody would love somebody as hideous as me. And, he's not like a dashingly handsome man, maybe, but he's an ordinary, he's just a guy. He's a normal looking guy.
Place me in time. What year are we when he's a child, roughly?
18. He's born in 1890.
It's so interesting because we have yet to do the Hemingway episode, which we will inevitably do.
Which is the same year, in 1892.
I think maybe roughly the same range. And this tactic or whatever it was, this approach of dressing little boys up as girls was not wholly uncommon. They would do it as a kind of it was like a little play that they would do. And Hemingway's mother dressed him as a little girl, and rather famously as well.
Yeah, the only other one I can think of is Charles Manson.
Well, I'm just really, really glad that nobody ever gave Hp Lovecraft a guitar.
Right. Yeah.
It was a common practice in this period. Absolutely. I think that the Lovecraft's mother's tendency to describe him as a girl, I think, indicates that she actually wanted a girl. That seems to have been the general tone of the whole thing.
Hers was like one notch or two notches higher than. Agreed. That's kind of what I get out of it as well. Nonetheless, clearly Lovecraft is a pretty gifted person, and so you see that in his childhood. He's reading at 3, writing at 4. He had this entire library, Whipple Van Buren Phillips's library of 2,000 books that was sort of at his disposal. And his grandfather, apparently, it seems to be, by all accounts I can come across, a very, very positive influence. He's a somewhat educated man. He traveled, particularly in Italy, and he lived kind of like a gentleman of old. You know what I mean? And this was an influence. This was a huge influence on Lovecraft, actually.
Whipple would actually speak with an affected British accent and teach Lovecraft to speak with that accent, which Lovecraft would continue to use not only in his writing, but to some extent in his personal interactions throughout his life, as speaking himself as sort of one of the better class of people, and this sort of thing. And it bequeathed him a library of 2,000 books, which was one of the largest classics libraries, if not the largest private classics library in New England at the time, original works in Greek and Latin. So as Lovecraft, at this age, he is reading, detective stories and dime novels and all that too, but then he's also reading, Thucydides and Cicero in the original Greek and Latin, and this is his pleasure reading as a kid. So
for a guy who, we're going to find out, didn't graduate high school, he had a sort of a great, maybe we could call that a homeschool sort of situation, right? Where he's definitely exposed to all of these things.
Is the word sheltered a good word we're talking about here? He was never a Boy Scout.
Well, he did have some degree of adventuring, but I would say he's fairly sheltered. Well, there's this two-pronged thing. His mother is sheltering him, and his grandfather is like telling him creepy ghost stories until late at night. So kind of yes and no, I guess.
It's one of the first times we're going to encounter this continuing theme of the puzzle pieces that don't seem to come from the same puzzle. He is being dressed as a girl and told that he's a girl and sheltered, and at the same time we have stories of him playing detective and pirate in the woods with his friends. He's playing war, playing guns with his friends. He likes to dig in the garden. He's a very rambunctious kid, likes to put on magic shows for the family. So it's not an easy psychological picture to fit together.
Yeah. And one of the early books that is an influence on him in a number of ways is Arabian Nights. And this prompts a sort of a lifelong fascination with the Middle East, the mystery and mystique and aesthetics of the Middle East, this notion that it's the cradle of civilization, that the religious wisdom comes from there, the desert,
the Orient,
right?
Orient.
You can kind of hear the music and he was very fascinated with this, and he gave himself then he was putting on magic shows when he did this, right? When
he would put on magic shows as a kid for his family, and he would dress up in his idea of Arabic dress, whatever that was, and he would use the name Abdul al-Hazred, which was sort of an Arabization of his. He had some cousins whose last name was Hazard, so this was his way of sort of trying to Arabize that. But Abdul al-Hazred is a completely incoherent attempt at an Arabic name. Lovecraft would later use it as the name of the author of the Necronomicon, the famous book that is the center of his sort of eldritch literature in his mythos. But Abdul al-Hazred, for all of Lovecraft's erudition in Latin and Greek, Abdul al-Hazred, the name in Arabic, means son of the Hazred. So it doesn't even actually mean, and actually in Arabic it should be Abdul Hazred with an H. So it's Lovecraft's, he's willing to go to the mat on Greek and Latin conjugations. When he writes at one point a story set in Roman Britain in which characters are actually speaking period accurate Latin and using idioms from the correct period in Roman history. But when he's writing about a character from the Arabic world, he can't even be bothered to look up an actual Arabic name.
Right. And whatever comes in hand. Yeah.
This will come back later in his fiction too, and throughout his fiction, he's going to other groups of people, like the horror at Red Hook is going to be one of his later stories where Kurdish devil worshippers, quote unquote, show up, and Hp Lovecraft can't even be bothered to look up what language Kurdish people speak or what their religious beliefs are. And so the theme that kind of goes on throughout his work is that when it comes to the West, he always is going to primary sources. When it comes to the Orient, he's always going through his own biases and through English-speaking authors who are exoticizing the East.
So he's a bit of a proto-weeb. He has like an anime avatar and has taken one semester of Japanese and has lots of opinions about Japan.
He's a proto-Redditor in so many senses. We're going to get into it.
So you start to see kind of his influences there with Arabian Nights, and there's something the I guess metafictional quality of Arabian Nights even starts to, you can kind of see that. Well, because pausing for kind of a second or sidebarring for kind of a second, I mean, what I was most impressed, my sort of favorite Lovecraft story is probably a little cliche, but I think Call of Cthulhu to me is the best Lovecraft story. And part of the reason I like it so much is this way in which it accomplishes its effect by these multiple sort of vectors occurring at once, right? It's somebody, my great uncle found an object and I'm going through his things, and then in the course of that I talk to somebody who has a story from it, and it's building this world because the world exists from all these different aspects. And to me that's something that's going on in Arabian Nights, right? That's a story within a story within a story.
And yet, strangely, in the Call of Cthulhu, as far as the protagonist, nothing really actually happens to the protagonist. You could a valid summary of the Call of Cthulhu is a guy reads his uncle's letters.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. No, for sure. And
but I mean, again, I keep coming back to Twitter as a metaphor, but imagine our graves with the QR codes that are going to be on our graves, and your great grandson comes up with his contacts and presses the button, and then suddenly he's inside your mind as you're living through COVID slowly going mad. There's a story.
I know. I could see a great grandnephew, whatever, just spending hours trying to figure out a single tweet of mine that I barely meant as a joke.
I'm going to make an NFT for that. People are going to have to pay for that if they want to do that with my grade.
Right. This is quite a good point, though, that you're making, Ben. This idea that nothing happens in the story. That, of course, is sort of the ultimate narrative horror. So you're mixing in this metaphorical nihilism or this sort of this darkness in the very structure of the thing that you're doing. He influenced so many people. I think didn't Wallach write a
Yes. Welbeck, that's another source that Brad and I both used as we're working on this episode. One of the things that Welbeck actually says is there is something not very literary about Lovecraft. To your point, absolutely. It's not quite narrative fiction. It's something a little different.
Yeah, and you see this. Well, we'll get into it because there's part of the there's something about when other people write in the Cthulhu world that it works better than. There's a lot of, we all three of us know there's a lot of like fan fiction out there, and I'm sure there's some gold out there, but there's something about writing in the Cthulhu mythos that doesn't feel like fan fiction anymore. It feels like participating in its own sort of genre. Its own. It doesn't feel like you're just sort of riffing on because there's no characters. I guess is ultimately what it is.
There's not a single protagonist in Lovecraft other than one character. There's one character, Randolph Carter, who recurs in a few of the Dream Cycle stories. But in the core Cthulhu mythos stories, there's not a single human character who recurs. There's not even a single human character who you can tell apart from any.
No, they're interchangeable. Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. It's fascinating that it works so well. So kind of getting back to like kind of starting to give you an impression of who he is more and more. So so there's time he will affect a British, not even a British. It's like it's a fake accent, right? Yeah. like a pretending to be British accent. Interestingly enough, Faulkner did the same thing. But he sort of fetishized the 18th century, really, and kind of was a person who believed that, probably believed that he belonged more rightly in that century than he did in his own. His writing style somewhat reflects that too. I mean, this is the 18th century. There's a lot of great literature from every century, but the 18th century is before anybody figured out show don't tell as a writing instruction. I shouldn't say anybody, but you know what I mean? Like the kind of sentence by sentence style that Lovecraft may have wrote in makes more sense in the 18th century idiom than in his own. And yet he's doing these crazy and innovative things, which is part of this sort of the strange brilliance of the whole project.
Yeah, it's this anachronistic style of prose, but doing something really modern in terms of theme. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
It comes back again to the library that he inherits from Whipple. It's in addition to the classics, there's a lot of works from the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And while Lovecraft is also reading dime novels, like the other kids, he's reading Don Quixote and Dante and Milton and Moby Dick, and this is his pleasure reading growing up.
Right. So he's putting those things together. So let's let me give you a little bit from another Lovecraft letter that's sort of on this theme. I think I am probably the only living person to whom the ancient 18th century idiom is actually a prose and poetic mother tongue, the naturally accepted norm, and the basic language of reality to which I instinctively revert despite all learned tricks. I would actually feel more at home in a silver-buttoned coat, velvet, small clothes, three-cornered hat, buckled shoes, Ranelagh bob wig, Steenkirk cravat, and all that goes with such an outfit from sword to snuff box, than in the plain modern garb that good sense bids me wear in this prosaic era. Meanwhile, what you don't hear is he's spelling most of this in like the old timey version. Prosaic is spelled Prosaick. He loves to spell showed SHEW. Oh yeah, for sure. I've always had subconscious feeling that everything since the 18th century is unreal or illusory, a sort of grotesque nightmare or caricature. People seem to me more or less like ironic shadows or phantoms, as if I could make them dissolve into thin air by merely pinching myself awake and shouting at them.
Whoa.
Yeah. So
I think the many such cases. I think a lot of people still feel this way, but don't know how to articulate that. Of all the people we've done so far, Brad, you could find all the episodes at artofdarkpod.com. Is Faulkner maybe the most adjacent?
I think so. I think not only in sort of birth, when he was born, but also the the fact that it's a sort of a once respected family kind of on the decline. The Faulkner family was reputable for maybe a few more generations than Lovecraft's, but he's in a house, a huge, estate kind of house, but it's on the decline. Money is sort of gradually dribbling out, and there's no new business ventures happening. Right. So there's definitely that. And then, they probably read a lot of the same work, to be honest, because Faulkner had his kind of dalliance with the pulp world too, right? He worked in Hollywood and he wrote Sanctuary and all of that.
I'm thinking about Oscar Wilde too, for some reason, although he was maybe a little
earlier.
I think more of Kafka. Kafka is one who I really think of.
Yeah, okay. There's definitely some over. Yeah, there's maybe a Venn diagram where there's Faulkner, Kafka,
grab bits and bobs and go, okay.
And one who you haven't done, Borges. Lovecraft always makes me think of Borges.
Yeah, we're gonna do Borges. Yeah, for sure. So, so kind of continuing on here, talking about these contradictions in his nature. He's still a boy. I think that when he's a boy, I still want to emphasize that. He put, we said he puts on magic shows, but he's also digging. Ben, you were saying he built Roman style aqueducts in the backyard.
Yeah, he had his mom apparently set aside a section of the yard or the garden for him to do his own digging in, and he was obsessed with Roman architecture in this period, and he actually dug a system of canals and little miniature Roman aqueducts by his own account in the garden to irrigate flower beds that he planted, and he would build little castles and forts and things there, and sort of had his own little world. The garden was his own little world in miniature, and he engineered it all to his own specifications.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So he's got that, right? And then he's also gets very interested in the sciences. He gets very interested in chemistry and astronomy, and at some point, he's fairly young. I had the year, and it looks like I don't have it now. But fairly young, he starts into doing handwritten, you'd call them periodicals, magazines or newsletters or whatever. One was called the Scientific Gazette, where he basically would just summarize things that he read in his chemistry textbook. And the other was the Rhode Island, and we're talking about it this is childhood. I think he's 10 years old or thereabouts when he's putting these out, when he's sort of making these. And the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy, which again, he's sort of just writing things that he knows about astronomy and these. And I find this very charming personally, because I made comic books when I was in elementary school. My friends and I would get together and we would draw comic books, and then we would get one of our moms to go Xerox them at work. And then, you'd have 5 copies of this 12-page comic book. And
kids do that. That's adorable. That's so good for kids. We need to keep doing stuff like that. Yeah. I
had a sci-fi magazine called Astro Magazine. It was a little zine that I printed on my family's, with print shop on my family's computer.
Yeah, it's cool. It's great, man. Right. And so Lovecraft is doing this, except it's 1897, right? It's just it's different. So it's kind of the same thing. Now, 1904 comes around. We'll get back to the amateur journalism stuff. But 1904 comes around. This is important because what happens is Whipple Van Buren dies. He leaves $5,000 to each of his daughters. That includes Susie, Lovecraft's mother, and $2,500 to Lovecraft. Now, that's kind of a lot of money. I didn't look up that year specifically, but we're talking probably 30 to 40x to get into today's dollars. So, Lovecraft gets left something I don't know. What's 40 times 2,500? $1 million?
It's not a small chunk of change.
No, it's not. I don't think it's $1 million. It's a lot. It's
$100,000. Hey, that's not nothing. You're a kid.
It's kind of an inconvenient amount of money because it's enough to buy a car, but it's not really enough to build a life on. Yeah,
exactly.
Tell me about it. Hoof.
No, I can't believe it. I couldn't do that math. I'm a little embarrassed.
Yeah, that's all. Look, one thing that I noticed is that
selling right now.
That's what I'm saying. Is that right? Yeah, and see, Lovecraft is a word cell and a shape rotator. I'm noticing this.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true. When Whipple dies, they have to move. So they have to move, right? They move 3 blocks away. And I've got a little thing to read about this moment in Lovecraft's life because it's a big deal. You grew up in this huge house with this big library and stables and a yard where you can build Roman aqueducts and not only leaving the house, but also his grandfather passing, who was clearly a big influence on him. So this is Lovecraft writing about this move. For the first time, I knew what a congested, servantless house, I thought that was interesting, servantless, with another family in the same house was. There was a vacant lot next door, which I promptly exploited as a landscape garden and adorned with a village of piano box houses, but even that failed to assuage my nostalgia. I felt that I had lost my entire adjustment to the cosmos, for indeed, what was HPL without the remembered rooms and hallways and hangings and statuaries and staircases and paintings? And yards and walks and cherry trees and fountain and ivy-grown arch and stable and gardens and all the rest. How could an old man of 14, he was always calling himself an old man, readjust his existence to a skimpy flat and new household program and inferior outdoor setting in which almost nothing familiar remained? Oof. So this was a big deal, this move. Yeah.
No more building aqueducts in the garden.
No more building aqueducts in the garden, right?
Downgrade.
Yeah.
We've gone from status to something like, I guess, middle class, not so something
sort
like
of.
that.
Yeah, I mean they're living off of and he's living with his mother, and she's a single mother. She's not sort of employed, and he doesn't have the counterbalancing influence of his grandfather anymore either. So you're kind of now whatever the pathologies of his relationship with Susie are, whatever those are, they're getting ramped up now, right? And they're he doesn't have a place to escape. He can't go into the
walls
backyard.
are closing in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What a sensitive person. That's something I'm noticing. He's just
he's incredible. Yeah.
He's sensitive.
Oh, he's a human nerve ending. Yeah.
He really is. He really is. Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. He does actually shortly after his grandfather died, his beloved cat died. His beloved cat named N-word Man is the closest we're going to get on this episode.
Yep.
Yikes. Well, that's what he named his cat. I'm not, you know what? Go talk to the people on Twitter about it if you want to.
Yep.
How long had he had the cat?
I mean, he had it, I think, since it was a kitten. I think he named it. I'm pretty sure.
Oh.
Yeah.
As far as I could tell.
All right.
So that's there. Now he enters high school, and you would think that a guy like Lovecraft would have this terrible time in high school, but I think he actually
I really do
it.
actually. I want to bully him.
Yeah.
Now.
He could use a good shove, I suppose.
I am not that guy. I'm really not. But I want to, yeah.
But listen to his description of the intellectual vistas that open up for him in high school. So this is again reading a letter. First year physics opened problems connected with the nature of visible phenomena and the operation of the universe, which my earlier chemistry and astronomy had not even suggested. Was it possible that educated men knew things about the basic structure of the cosmos, which invalidated all my confidently held concepts? And God, what a surprise history was proving, the whole pageantry of the Byzantine Empire and its hostile connection with that gorgeous Islam, which my early Arabian Nights and my later astronomical studies had made close to me, swept unheralded on my sight. And for the first time, I heard of the lost Minoan culture, which Sir Arthur Evans was even then busily digging up in Crete. Assyria and Babylonia too stood out with greater impressiveness than ever before, and I heard at last of the eternal query of Easter Island. What a world! Why, good God, a man might keep busy forever, even in an uncongenial environment, learning new things. So we see here something where Lovecraft can actually find a little meaning in life. He did love to learn things. He wanted to figure out chemistry, even though he would kind of prove to not be particularly left-brained in that manner in terms of like making a career of being a chemist or something along those lines. But he was interested in it. Same goes for astronomy. Same goes for history. Same goes for religion, even though he was a lifelong atheist in his own words. Same for all of these things. He was a preternaturally and precociously interested person, which is to me maybe among his most excuse me, among his most redeeming qualities, and probably how you get to write this innovative work that really nobody has ever seen before, is because he's willing to pull from all these different places.
And really a romantic when it comes to nature and the sciences. I mean,
Mhm.
you hear a little bit of Shelley and Byron in that, just
Mhm.
the wonder of the cosmos.
Right. Yeah, he's a little bit younger, especially when he's younger. There is a sense that he's a little bit in love with the world, and unfortunately, I think that kind of goes away, to a certain extent. I'm gonna kind of, well, yeah. So here's the thing: he doesn't graduate high school because in 1906 he has a nervous breakdown.
Like
it's not
father,
really
like son.
Yeah, it's not particularly well explained, and despite Lovecraft's voluminous letters, these breakdowns aren't really described in detail by him. I mean, he will refer to the fact that he had them, and that these periods were, say, difficult, but he won't really go into what the particular, convolutions of the neuroses actually were, generally speaking. Part of the problem, I think, and this isn't to cast aspersions on a person that's having a nervous breakdown. I mean, that's something, mental health is a serious thing, and these things need to be sort of dealt with and aided to whatever extent they can. I don't think it helped Lovecraft that he was surrounded by people coddling him all the time. I think there probably would have been some benefit to somebody just telling Lovecraft to suck it up occasionally. This isn't to say, depression is real, and if, go talk to somebody and all of that, but I don't think it would have hurt for someone, to give him a
feel
encouraging shove.
That acute absence of the father here, particularly in a society that is as still patriarchal and masculine as that period would have been. So you can see how this would put him deeply at odds with his contemporaries and with the world around him.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Can I just read a brief excerpt? This is a letter that
he wrote.
Yeah, this is a letter that he wrote during this period. He's 17 years old, and it says, "I perceive now that I am becoming too aged to feel any pleasure." This is Lovecraft at 17. "Unsympathetic times have let their ferocious grip fall on me, and I am 17. Big boys don't play with dolls' houses and pretend gardens, and, full of sorrow, I must cede my world to a younger boy who lives the other side of the garden. And after this time, I will never again dig the earth or make paths and roads, because the fugitive joy of childhood will never be known again. Adulthood is hell."
Yeah. Oof.
And he's not wrong about that, right? But part of the thing too is he's coming from money, but not enough money. He's never really sort of told he's got it. He's never really. You get the sense that he was never really given the talking to about it. He's got to grow up. They had just enough money that he could kind of skate by without really ever taking responsibility, and that sort of thing. He doesn't end up graduating high school. His mother kind of takes him out when she feels like he needs to be out, and he kind of malingers around the house. And then he takes, I think, a reduced course load in what would be his senior year, 1907, 1908. And then after high school, for about 5 years, he would essentially live as a recluse. And we're not talking about necessarily he's in this period, he's not feverishly writing the great works that he would come to be known for in this period, right?
He's writing a lot of letters, though.
He is writing a lot of letters, yes.
Today he would be locked in his room on Reddit 14 hours a day. He's becoming a NEET.
He is becoming a NEET, absolutely. Yeah. He's a NEET. He's a little bit of a neckbeard. He's very and he has some of the qualities of those kind of characters that we, kind of come to know. Like he's, we'll get into that later. He's frankly, he's a racist. He's a reactionary.
He does sound like a bit of a bigot. He has the Oriental fixation. Go on.
Yeah, and it goes beyond that. We'll get. I think the proper place to really contextualize that is when he eventually moves to New York. But it's still it's here now already in his letters and in the things that he's reading. I want to read you a description from a neighbor about how sort of reclusive he is in this 5-year period after high school. And I have a speculative theory about this 5-year period that we'll talk about in the After Dark when we answer the question of, is Cthulhu real? Okay, so this is from a neighbor, and this is describing that 5-year period. As a little girl, I was scared to death of him, for he used to walk rapidly up and down Angel Street at night, just as a group of us were playing hare and hounds at the corner of Angel and Patterson Streets. His appearance always frightened me. He was certainly the neighborhood mystery. He would never speak to any of us, but kept right on with his head down. Once in a while, I would pass him in the day, but never could get him to say hello. Right. And then here's another part that just happens to be right here. He's describing this mysterious collapse that happened in 1908. The deadly fatigue and lethargy which accompany a state of health such as that under which I have been staggering for 10 years or more. At times, the very effort of sitting up is unsupportable, and the least added exertion brings on a sort of dull tiredness, which shows itself in the lagging brilliancy and occasional incoherence of my literary and apostolatory productions. I am only about half alive. A large part of my strength is consumed in sitting up or walking. So there's a physical aspect to this too. And there's one thing he seemed to have, which was his body. He wasn't able to regulate his body temperature very well, apparently.
Yeah, poikilothermism, he called it.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. I was trying to find it.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I don't know that it was ever medically diagnosed, but he claimed that he was effectively cold-blooded. He had a reptilian metabolism, was what he claimed.
Okay. All right. Yep. A little bit quirky there.
A little bit quirky.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this is the kind of guy we're dealing with. We've got a couple more brush strokes to get in there. But one thing that's happening in these 5-year period is he's reading a ton. I mean, this has got to be what's happening, right? So he's reading, and he's also continuing with, the various scientific studies he's doing, chemistry and astronomy and so forth. But he's studying, he reads the Bible. He reads Jules Verne. He reads Edgar Allan Poe, which is one of his greatest influences. He reads Lord Dunsany, which is probably maybe even a bigger influence. He reads Machen. He reads Blackwood, that's sort of the classic weird fiction forerunners to Lovecraft. So he's reading, this is where we start getting precursors to the pulp magazines too, like Argosy, All-Star, Cavalier. These are sort of the forerunners to weird tales in which Lovecraft would eventually sort of make his bones. To the degree that anybody came to know Lovecraft, it would be through weird tales. And these magazines, the sort of proto versions of these magazines, are going on while Lovecraft is in this his post high school doldrums kind of phase.
And not just magazines, but books, actually. Like Dunsany, Machen, and Blackwood, all three of them were recognized as not necessarily A-list celebrities, but I mean, they were well-known authors at this time. Edgar Allan Poe and Ambrose Bierce, of course, are still known today. We read, Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge in high school and The Raven. But Dunsany, Blackwood, and Machen were as famous, if not more famous, than Poe and Bierce at this time when Lovecraft is a teenager.
Really? See, I didn't realize how well known they were. I knew
they were. Yeah. Blackwood actually had his own radio show on the BBC where he would read stories. He was very popular. Dunsany, Lovecraft actually, during this period, I want to say it was 1919 when Lovecraft was in his early 20s, so a little after this period, actually meets Dunsany on a transatlantic book tour. So he actually goes to see Dunsany, drags himself out of bed on one of these rare occasions when he leaves the house to go to another town and get his book signed by by Dunsany and sort of say, "I love you, senpai." And Arthur Machen also was popular enough that his novels were getting printed and distributed as paperbacks on the front at World War I, during World War I. And that's another thing that we really kind of should bring in as context here, is that this is, going into 1914, 1915, this is the start of World War I. And during wartime periods, there's always a resurgence in horror and an excavation in the horror authors of the past. And during World War I, of course, this is the time when Kafka is producing a lot of his stuff. There's a resurgence of influence in Ambrose Bierce and Edgar Allan Poe, Bierce himself being a Civil War veteran. There's a resurgence in like werewolf and vampire tales, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, Gothic romance, vampires and werewolves. All this kind of stuff is coming back into the cultural mainstream, as it always does in times of war. And Blackwood, Machen, and Dunsany are sort of the modern masters, the around 1890s to 1910s, the forerunners, the forefront of this movement.
Yeah, interesting. And I knew a bit about Blackwood and Machen. The Lord Dunsany he's such a fascinating figure, right? I mean, he's like, he lived in a castle or something. Like, he was an actual baron, right? Yeah,
he actually was. His full name is Edward Plunkett Drax Baron Lord Dunsany. So I think might even be missing some parts of it there. Right. It's one of those British names that there's like 8 parts to it. Right. And yeah, he is an extraordinary writer. He was, by all accounts, sort of a Byronic, Anglo-Scots man's man with a big mustache, liked to go hunting in the countryside. But he was sort of a Tolkien before Tolkien. He created stories that you could consider proto-fantasy. One of his most famous books, which I actually have a first edition of, is called The Gods of Pagana. It's a collection of short stories which are a collection of mythological tales, basically, set in a fictional world called Pagana. The inspiration from the Arabian Nights is obvious, but it's, thieves come to steal treasure, idols come to life. There's stories of the creation of the world and cataclysms that the gods are responsible for, and great battles between empires that the gods take sides on. And this all takes place, some of it takes place in the primordial past of Earth before, the time before writing. Some of it seems to take place in a dream world. So again, we have a tie there to Lovecraft's childhood dream world, which is hugely important to him as a kid and will become important later in his fiction. But so in many ways, Lovecraft feels very connected to Dunsany. So you can see why this is a guy, when Dunsany is doing his book tour in New England, you can see why Lovecraft is willing to drag himself out of bed and get in a motor car to go to another town to get Dunsany to sign his book. He's like, this guy gets it. This guy writes. This guy is speaking straight to my soul.
Yeah, I think you sort of said this, but I want to like double strike on this point. The first time I think that Lovecraft leaves Providence for like several years is to go see Dunsany.
Yep.
Yeah. There's something interesting about this too, about the fact that Lovecraft is from Rhode Island, which is this tiny, like, Rhode Island is the closest state we have to a fictional state. If you don't, right? Like, it's so, this is no dismissal of Rhode Island people. I don't know anything about Rhode Island, to be honest, other than what I've read.
It is going to come in so hot. At Brad Kelly.
Yeah, you wrote
all 5 of the people who live in Rhode Island.
Right. You're coming after me.
What have you done, Brad?
Yeah. I pick enemies that I can crush in one hand, punching down. But there's something about Lovecraft being from there. It's like you could write a story where you just invented a tiny little state, right? And it would be Rhode Island.
Well, and it is sort of annoying.
It's very evocative. Oh, I'm sorry.
It is. Yeah.
Not at all. No, it's sort of an annoying name for a state too, because it's not an island. It does sort of stick in your craw a little bit. I think, especially as somebody from the Midwest, it's like, what is this? Why do I have to learn this tiny place? What is the history of this? It just sort of stinks of like plantations and colonialism.
It was a Rhode Island plantation, I think, originally.
The state's original name is King James's King James's something Providence and Providence Plantation, which is actually what Lovecraft will insist on referring to it as throughout his life. He will refer to it as Providence Plantation. Yeah. And at times when people at public events stand up and sing "My Country 'Tis of Thee," Lovecraft will stand up and sing the lyrics to "God Save the King" and then brag about it to his friends afterwards.
Yeah. He was a loyalist.
Yeah, he was a British loyalist.
Wow. Okay. All right. Things are starting to make
we're
a
just
lot
like
more
off
sense.
the charts, neckbeard, off the charts neckbeard.
Upvote.
So we're gonna eventually we're gonna get out of this sort of this. I think as I read this and as I'm processing Lovecraft and thinking about the age where all of this stuff is happening, right? The 5 years after your high school aged, 18 to say 23, which I know for me was this very formative period, and because that's college years, right? So if you either went to college and you had that experience, or you didn't, and that was equally formative, but in a different way. Lovecraft spends most of this alone in his room, right? So I think this is actually critical to make sure we get our head around. But before he comes out of it, I want to kind of make sure we understand who we're talking about. So he's a loyalist, which that's bizarre. He speaks with like a British affectation. For a long time, he was wearing his father's like old-fashioned clothes before he eventually did give that up as well. He is obsessed with this idea of being a gentleman, but in the old-fashioned version of like you own some land and that's how you make your living and you never dirty your fingertips, that kind of thing. But he didn't own any land. Right? The closest thing that he had was his grandfather Whipple had owned part of a Snake River quarry claim out in Idaho, and so there was kind of some money coming through from that. But that doesn't. So in a sense, he was like landed, but only like in the fine print. But he didn't want to work, and he wasn't willing to get his hands dirty. And this attitude like persisted throughout his life, and it would become problematic in ways that I think are obvious. But in other smaller ways too. He's trying to get he's getting editing and ghost writing work. He kind of won't ask people to pay him. So you're doing freelance. We've all three of us have done some freelance work. If you aren't willing to ask for your money, you're in rough shape. Like it's not gonna work out for you.
Lovecraft took all the worst parts of being an aristocrat. He took all the snobbiness and the I'm better than you and I'm not willing to work, and he left all the good parts of being an aristocrat.
Right.
The generosity. Being a patron of the arts.
He's a real American, in other words.
Yeah.
Yes.
A Yankee.
Yeah, for sure. We'll get to this more when we get to his marriage. He was curiously sexless. And I think we'll hit on more on that when he does get married. But very little, it's one of these things where I think he could present it as being refined and being, kind of old fashioned, but was actually probably really freaked out by sex is what I think.
I think he for some reason, it just didn't connect for him. I think he might have been what today we would call asexual or demisexual, where it's like he could form an attachment to a particular person, but in general,
and that could be what we're dealing with too. And I'm a little more likely to think that he has hangups mostly because of his other qualities. Yeah. Right? Like if everything else was sort of like more what we would think of as normal, I wouldn't think of it so much, but to me, this fits in with his relationship with his mother and this reclusiveness. And
I'm just trying to imagine what a date with him would.
Yeah. Well, he would pull out your chair. He would be completely polite, completely courteous.
All right. Okay, I'm kind of into it. Okay.
He's. This is the thing. Everybody says this about him. He's extremely nice and polite. And he has those aspects of being a gentleman. He's very.
But in the course of the date, he might also refer to you as my darling granddaughter. So that was the thing he liked. That was the thing he liked to do. He liked to walk around in starched collars and refer to himself as old Uncle Theobald and say, "Oh, my darling granddaughter, won't you come and dandle on my knee?" Which would be a little weird on a date.
Right.
So, yeah.
I knew if I put it out there, you'd come back with something. And that exceeded my expectations. Yeah.
He was the comp says that he had a schizoid personality. And schizoid doesn't mean, it's got the same root as schizophrenic, but it's not quite the same. I did have a little thing I kind of wanted to read referring to this schizoid personality thing. Let me quick find it. This is from Lovecraft writing to a good friend of his, Sam Loveman. My one desire is to remain inconspicuous and unnoticed. This is later in life, but I think it ties in. If I could render myself invisible, I would gladly do so. I avoid the ordinary run of human beings and have imbibed much of the philosophy of good old Bishop Berkeley, who denied the existence of matter and even the actuality of life itself. Nothing really exists for me. Dreams provide me with a solution to the fantastic ambiguity that we choose to call life. Right? So this is somebody who's...
And he's in the period of Freud. Where are we around Freud?
Freud is right around this time frame.
Yeah.
Lovecraft hates Freud, by the way. Just going to put that out there. He dismisses the entirety of Freud's work as quote unquote puerile symbolism.
Yes.
That's what he calls Freud.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I don't doubt it. But this fixation, this fascination on dreams is a thing. Freud made his whole career on dreams.
There's something going on at the beginning of the 20th century, I think. Because we see this amongst many people, right? I mean, Kafka, we see this in Kafka. We see this in Joyce. We see this in Lovecraft. We see this in Freud and Jung. There's a moment that happens somewhere around the turn of the century where it's like a mini axial age or something, where everybody starts to realize that it's like European culture forgot that it had dreams, and then all of a sudden it remembered one, and it was like, wait, what was that? There's something very fascinating about all that to me.
Well, and of course, again, in Freud's whole program, well, not all of it, but it hinges so heavily on dream analysis, which very interesting. Very interesting.
Let me give you one more thing about this sort of schizoid personality thing, again from a letter by Lovecraft. As for me, I have retired conclusively from the present age. In a cosmos of aimless chaos and upon a planet of futility and decay, nothing but fancy is of any importance. Time and space are the sheerest incidentals, and when one lived in a decadent and disillusioned age which has nothing of moment to say, it becomes a man of sense to stop wasting his time on contemporary fumbling and turn back to a period whose utterances have something in them to which his own psychology responds. So he's just a very Lovecraftian guy.
Sleep and dreams and the cosmos are becoming extraordinarily important to him in this period. I actually wanted to tie this to, there's a story that he writes shortly after this called Beyond the Wall of Sleep that I just want to read a few sentences from.
Please.
It's one of the most beautiful passages in all of Lovecraft. To give a little context on this is a story about a mental patient who is sort of a drooling idiot during the day and seems to be inhabited by an extraterrestrial consciousness at night, and begins communicating with his psychiatrist. And it turns out that the psychiatrist himself knows the extraterrestrial intelligence from a past lifetime. And this is what the extraterrestrial intelligence says to the psychiatrist through the mouth of this mental patient. He says, "I am an entity like that which you yourself become in the freedom of dreamless sleep. I am your brother of light and have floated with you in the effulgent valleys. It is not permitted me to tell your waking earth self of your real self, but we are all roamers of vast spaces and travelers in many ages. Next year I may be dwelling in the dark Egypt which you call ancient, or in the cruel empire of San Chan, which is to come 3,000 years hence. You and I have drifted to the worlds that reel about the red Arcturus and dwelt in the bodies of the insect philosophers that crawl proudly over the fourth moon of Jupiter. How little does the earth's self know of life and its extent? How little, indeed, ought it to know for its own tranquility."
That is some psychedelic stuff. right?
That always
really
makes me think of Rutger Hauer's android monologue in Blade Runner. I've seen things you people can't imagine.
Right. It's glimpsing, it's sort of glimpsing beyond the wall of sleep is like a perfect title for something like that. That's kind of amazing, right? So clearly he's something is going on. There's this, and there's a couple other periods like this in his life where there's this sort of chrysalis period, and he's sort of withdrawing, and he's processing himself to become the Lovecraft that's going to kind of come out of it. He's dwelling in ideas like this. Some of these are these beautiful efflorescences of thought and imagination, and others are not so great, like the fact that he's becoming dramatically more racist and xenophobic during this reclusive period. We are going to get more to this in New York because that's when it reaches its sort of fever pitch. But I want to give you an instance of what, when we talk about him being racist, when he was an ardent racist, what do we actually mean? There is a poem that he wrote that is called On the Creation of N-Words. When long ago the gods created earth, in Jove's fair image, man was shaped at birth. The beasts for lesser parts were next designed, yet were they too remote from humankind to fill the gap and join the rest to man. The Olympian host conceived a clever plan. A beast they wrought in semi-human figure, filled with vice, and called the thing a N-word.
Man, what is he doing writing this? That's just it's what he's on.
So again, we come back to the puzzle pieces that don't seem to come from the same. This is the guy who writes the beautiful passage about light beings from dreams. I am your brother of light. And then he writes, he writes this. Almost the same age. Yeah,
same sort of milieu, right? So we're gonna continue this, because here's the thing: we could just ignore Lovecraft's racism and xenophobia. That's not really what we do on the show, and it's such a prominent thing in his life. It's not like he kind of disliked his Mexican neighbor. It's not that. It's like
it's some real calculated, methodical, cosmological racism.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, humans breeding with things they shouldn't be breeding with. That's Lovecraft.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's the thing is, I don't think you can extricate it from his work either.
Right.
I don't.
And that's not what we want to do on this show. This is Art of Darkness, so we focus on this stuff because, of course, they will cleverly paint over it because of the Lovecraft industry and all of this. But, yeah, it's such an interesting thing that a guy would have this atheism and this sort of horror at the modern world would also carry this reactionary baggage and not be a more enlightened, progressive Yankee. It's very interesting.
Right. I'm going to give you one more quick rundown of a few more of his sort of idiosyncrasies, and then we're still kind of in this reclusive 5-year formative period, but we're going to break through it in just a moment. But I want to give you just a rundown of some of his other eccentricities and sort of uptightnesses. So, in the interest of painting the full Lovecraft picture. So this is again from the biography. Ingrown hairs on his face bothered him all his life. The only cure for this condition is to grow a beard, but as a devotee of the clean-shaven Baroque era, Lovecraft hated all facial hair. He said, "I'd as soon think of wearing a nose ring as of growing a mustache." Later, when some of his young literary protégés grew mustaches, or worse yet, goatees, he carped at them in letter after letter, urging them to take off the offending growths. His skin was pale from his nocturnal habits. His friend Paul Cook reported that he never liked to tan, and a trace of color in his cheeks seemed somehow to be a source of annoyance. He was the only person I ever met to be ashamed of a coat of tan. He had this is about the temperature thing, the body regulation temperature thing. A little bit further down. In dress, he was clean and neat, but ultra conservative in taste. In his 20s, he affected an aggressively old-fashioned appearance, a sedulous cultivation of premature elderliness and sartorial antiquarianism manifesting itself in a stiff bosom shirt, round cuffs, black coat and vest, and gray striped trousers, standing collar and black string tie, etc., with austere and reticent manners to match. He also donned black bow ties and high-button shoes and carried an old-fashioned change purse. He wore his father's elegant 19th century garments until they wore out. So you got a strange dude.
This is a
Old Uncle
strange
Theobald.
dude.
Yeah, old Uncle Theobald, right?
I'm beginning to put the pieces together, and it's beginning to occur to me that he is the monster.
A little bit. There's a part of him that is, for sure. Yeah.
There was a fellow, when I worked at a used bookstore here in the Twin Cities, there was a fellow who would come in dressed in old-timey clothes, and you could tell he was enjoying himself. And I had no problem with it. This was back when there were a lot more characters on the street. Like, this seems to have been cut out of a lot of public life. I don't know where it went. They must have gone somewhere. But he would come into the bookstore. He would peruse. He wouldn't say a word to me, but he would always pay with the Sakakawea dollars, the $1.
Really? Yeah.
And he would pull them out of an old purse or something. And he would pay, if you get a book, it would be a paperback, 6 of them. And I'd make change for him. And you could tell he was savoring the transaction. This was not, he was not swiping a credit card. There was some sort of a LARP happening for him.
Right.
And hey, good for you, dude.
Yeah.
You got
maybe we should all be LARPing a little bit more.
We should maybe all
rather than letting
to some of this,
the basilisk take our lives over. And
right. Yeah, true. Yeah. So fair to say Lovecraft, very much a man out of time.
Yeah, I think that's maybe one of the strongest cases for a man out of time that you could really pluck out of artistic history, at least.
Did he have a strong opinion on Nietzsche?
He did read Nietzsche, I believe, or was at least passingly familiar with him.
We'll get into this a little bit later when he becomes openly a Nazi sympathizer.
Fun!
Yeah, so the fun continues on that.
In case you didn't see that coming, yeah. Okay. So in this 5-year period, just to kind of keep on track with the biographical kind of narrative, it ends sort of, or he comes out of it. I do think of this as a sort of a chrysalis period, or one of a few that he has, in which he sort of comes out of it into being the new Hp Lovecraft, and he comes out of it through amateur journalism. He sort of discovers this sort of coincidentally. He was doing the Rhode Island or the Providence Science Gazette, and doing these little things when he was a kid, but he kind of kept doing it. He started writing a newsletter called The Conservatives, not The Conservatives, The Conservative. I think the first article had a whole thing about being, I can't remember what it was. He had I think the first article had some kind of racist tirade in it, if I'm not mistaken. First edition.
I know the article that you're talking about. I can't remember exactly what he said in it, but it was a manifesto, basically. He published his manifesto, and his manifesto was, we should go back to the 1700s. That was the time when things were correct. Everything since then has been a mistake.
Right.
Yeah.
And, aside from the race stuff, I kind of get I get that tendency. I do understand the idea of like, I don't like how things are, and I think we should go back. Again, the race, that stuff is reprehensible, but like the whole like he didn't really like the idea of like machines taking over.
How could you live through, because what period are we in now? What year roughly?
It's like 1913.
Yeah, we're watching the Great War kick off, and
starting soon.
They've already seen the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War and the mechanization of warfare, which presaged what would happen then at scale in World War I. How could you be a sensitive person and not look at the conflagration in Europe and the death of the old order as a kind of horror? We have this bizarre fixation on modernity or modernism because we can't imagine anything else. But it's
Well,
the
and we
amount
have
of
a
human
thing for-
suffering that the 20th century stands in for is staggering.
Yeah.
And yeah, go on, Brad.
And we have a thing, we seem to have this tendency where like everything has to progress. Progress is always good. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's going in the right direction because time is passing. So it must be getting better. Where it's like, well, hold on, maybe it isn't always getting better. Like maybe some things are getting better and some things are getting worse. Like just, you know.
What Lovecraft once actually wrote to a friend, he said, "What I abhor most is change in all its forms." So, yeah. And
right.
meanwhile,
he invents an entire genre of literature.
Yeah. It's a good,
right.
It's a good point. And yet his stories are set in this world that's sort of not really the world that he lives in. He sets the dates and as if they're happening in the 1920s and the 1930s, but it's like unusual if a character has a motor car or a flashlight. And it's like, I remember even as a kid reading these stories thinking like, wasn't this guy writing in the 1930s? Like, why is he describing cars as if they're unusual?
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But
they are unusual. Cars are weird.
They are kind of a monster.
They're a monster. How many people are going to die on the roads tomorrow?
You know, I didn't quote this, but I definitely could have. He had a thing where I don't know if he flew in an airplane or something like this, and he thought it was sort of fun, but at the same time was like, this is a terrible development. Like. Like we shouldn't. This is going to be a problem. This like this mechanization or this.
He already has this vision of people landing in places they don't belong or planes flying into buildings. You can imagine if you have that pessimistic outlook, every new piece of technology does presage a kind of horror.
Yeah, I think.
Which just creates this supreme irony that so many of the people who discover Lovecraft today are discovering him through video games, RPGs, digital media, an entire range of media that he would have absolutely abhorred and had nothing to do with.
That's not surprising. That's not surprising. So he's doing this amateur journalism thing. This article, The Conservative. This is one of the few. This is maybe the first subject we've had on this show who is like an unabashed conservative, like in temperament and, well, even politically, he's so freaking complicated. We'll get to it, but he was both like a Hitler supporter and an FDR supporter simultaneously. It's very strange.
Well, it's very interesting because when you actually
he died, Lovecraft died before like the Holocaust. So who knows what his image of Hitler was? Isn't the History Channel image of Hitler? But that's also not to say that's not to say that was okay. I don't know. It's very
Hitler's own ideas about what the post-war order would look like if Germany had been victorious are much different from, I think, the Hollywood clown car version that we get. He really saw a world order where America and Germany and German ethnics in America would rise up, and it would be a completely different sort of game plan than I think people imagine. There was much more of an idea that maybe the West will. Which side is the West going to? It was way more complicated coming up to that war.
There was an American Nazi party during World War II. So we'll get into that later as we talk about
a good book to read on this if you're interested in the period running up to World War II is Human Smoke. It reads like a novel, but it's not. And then the other sort of ugly thing that people tend to forget about is how awful the British Empire was and how many people across the planet despised the British Empire in the run up to that war. So there you go, a little bit of context.
Yeah. So moving on to just kind of keep this biographical train rolling. So Lovecraft ends up developing a bunch of friends in the amateur journalism world. Surprisingly, he ends up developing kind of a rich social life out of this, which is, I think, interesting because he kind of finds it in his own way. How he gets there from publishing The Conservative to being like at the center of the amateur journalism world in a way is he writes a 1,300-word declamation of the pop author Fred Jackson. It's a letter written in what Lovecraft himself calls a quaint Queen Anne prose style, where he basically says, this Fred Jackson guy who writes in the Argosy and some of these other pulp things, he's basically, his stories have too much romance and love in them, and they really shouldn't be in the magazine, right? Because Lovecraft, all that stuff is sort of like, and so I think it's a little uncomfortable for him to read all of this stuff. But he writes this letter, it gets published, and I believe in the Argosy, and then other writers write in to criticize him, and then he writes these like responses in this like pretentious poetic style, and this goes on for years. This sort of beef in the amateur journalism world. But they're also kind of having fun with it. I think Fred Jackson and Hp Lovecraft might even had some unpublished correspondence with each other, and I think they were sort of enjoying the fun of it, the drama of it, right? The going back and forth.
Lovecraft really, he would have a lot of fun poking fun at the tropes of popular fiction in his period. If you think you know H.P. Lovecraft, go Google a story called Sweet Ermengarde. It's Lovecraft's parody of like melodramatic, sort of snidely whiplash romance from the early 20th century, and it's actually really funny. It's a really funny story, and it's Lovecraft's probably only serious attempt at humor, and he does it in the Lovecraft way. He does it with absolute 100% sincerity. Right. But it's so it's this weird thing where he's like he's at full, he's up to 11. He's at full blast intensity, but he's also having fun and like forming friendships. Yeah.
Why do I get the sense that Cthulhu is about to be born?
We're getting there. It's like a lot of other things where it trickles in, and then it's all of a sudden it's there. Right? It's there. It's like it's always been there. Go ahead.
He does write a story in this period called Dagon, which is a precursor to the Call of Cthulhu, and it's a relatively short story. It's only about 5 pages or so, and it's about a sailor who gets wrecked on an island and finds these pre-human ruins that are all like non-Euclidean geometry and covered with strange runes. And then there's there's this fish-like being, this giant fish-like being who appears and whose name is Dagon, which comes from a name of an ancient Mesopotamian sea god, and sort of chases him around the island. And then the sailor makes it back home. And then the final image of the story is that he looks out the window and sees this giant hand coming up and grabbing the window. And this is a story that Lovecraft publishes in this amateur journalism period, and it attracts a little bit of a fandom. Again, this is not professional. He's not seeing professional print publication, but in the amateur journalism world, people are reading this and they're like, okay, like this guy is out here doing some stuff.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's the first. That is really the first. He had written. It's clearly not the first thing he'd written. He'd written articles and some stories, but this is the first thing that I think you could say is the first Cthulhu story would be Dagon. And then he kind of walks away from it for a little while, and he writes the Beyond the Wall of Sleep, as you quoted, actually is written after Dagon. So one thing I wanted to read, I came across my notes and it's not quite in the right place, but I wanted to read something about the this is from the his newsletter, The Conservative, the first issue of it, which came out in, I think, 1915. He made 210 copies of it. The first article is actually a complaint about simplified spelling because he likes the old-fashioned spelling, right? This is his newsletter. This is his wild newsletter. Not wild, but like this harebrained newsletter that he's trying to give to people. First article, complain about people spelling things in a simplified modern style. The second article is something called The Crime of the Century. I'm going to read a little bit of it. The present European war, occurring as it does in an age of hysterical sentimentality and unsound political doctrines, has called forth from the sympathizers of each set of belligerents an unexampled torrent of indiscriminate denunciation. You can see he loves those big words. That the maintenance of civilization rests today with that magnificent Teutonic stock, which is represented alike by the two hotly contending rivals, England and Germany, as well as by Austria, Scandinavia, Switzerland, Holland, and Belgium, is undeniably true as it is vigorously disputed. The Teuton is the summit of evolution. That we may consider intelligently his place in history, we must cast aside the popular nomenclature which would confuse the names Teuton and German and view him not nationally but racially. Though some ethnologists have declared that the Teuton is the only true Aryan and that the languages and institutions of the other nominally Aryan races were derived alone from his superior speech and customs, it is nevertheless not necessary for us to accept the daring theory in order to appreciate his vast superiority to the rest of mankind. So, yeah.
Oh, we got a bit of he's a little bit of a supremacist there.
A little bit.
Yeah,
little bit.
he likes the Nordic Superman a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's another thing.
What kind of, may I ask, what kind of drugs or substances are we dealing with here? Is he a boozer? Do we know? Nothing. He's a teetotaler.
Abstinence. Total abstinence. We will get to it. He got drunk one time in his life, but it was unwittingly.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another thing.
He likes to lucid dream. He's a lucid dream person.
Right.
Of all, I must say, of all the figures we've done so far on Art of Darkness, artofdarkpod.com, at artofdarkpod on Twitter, this is the most unusual person.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot, and as our friend Ben was saying, I cannot wrap my head around this guy. We avoid psychologizing on the show.
Yeah.
We're not analysts. We're not trying to figure somebody out. But this guy is just, I can't pin him down.
It's like what Richard Feynman famously said about quantum physics. Anybody who tells you they understand quantum physics hasn't studied it enough. Yeah. If you think you understand HP Lovecraft, turn to the next page.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a very and the kind of the hits keep coming in a certain way.
Yeah.
But I am interested this amateur journalism part. But so it's interesting because he becomes a very social person in an unusual sort of manner. He becomes primarily social in this his sort of mid-20s period through writing his newsletter, writing letters to people, which he did all the time, and in participating in this amateur journalism world. He's so involved in this that he joins the National Amateur Publishers Association, and I think it's the United Amateur Publishers Association. He joins these sort of groups. He would be at varying times. We won't get into the details because there's a lot of internecine drama between these groups. But he gets to be in the leadership of some of these amateur journalist associations. Almost all of his friends throughout the rest of his life, he would meet either through these groups or through correspondence, people that wrote him letters. Some of these people would go on to have fairly prolific careers of their own, even if they're not so well known anymore. Ira Albert Cole, who is this sort of Kansas cowboy poet. W. Paul Cook, who would be a close friend for many years. Samuel Loveman, who is a poet of some renown, who also introduced H.P. Lovecraft to Hart Crane. Lovecraft would meet the great poet Hart Crane a number of times. Clark Ashton Smith, who is a phenomenal writer in his own right. Robert E. Howard, the man who created Conan, and who also wrote in the Cthulhu Mythos from time to time. He would develop all of these relationships through first the amateur journalism world, and then through his participation in Weird Tales, which kind of comes a little bit later. Well, I want to read one thing. This is interesting because Hart Crane they weren't close, though they met a couple of times. Hart Crane is an episode that I want to do, and I want to sort of eventually. And I want to kind of give you the sense of what it was like when they met each other, what they thought of each other. I thought I had something from Hart Crane, but maybe I don't. Oh, yeah, here we go. Crane wrote, this is after they meet. And this is a little bit later than our timeline, but it's all good because we're talking about his social life. Hart Crane wrote to his mother about Lovecraft. I've been greeted so far by by Lovemans. That's Lovecraft's friend. He has a friend named Loveman, which I think is just an interesting coincidence. I've been greeted so far by Loveman's coattails. So occupied has Sambo been with numerous friends of his here ever since arriving. Miss Sonia Green, who we're going to talk about a lot more. and her piping-voiced husband, Howard Lovecraft, the man who visited Sam in Cleveland one summer when Galpin was also there, kept Sam traipsing around the slums and wharf streets until 4 a.m. looking for colonial specimens of architecture. Until Sam told me he groaned with fatigue and begged for the subway. So that's a little bit about their time in New York, and we'll get there. But here's Lovecraft on Hart Crane. Poor Crane, a real poet and man of taste, descendant of an ancient Connecticut family and a gentleman to his fingertips, but the slave of dissipated habits which will soon ruin his constitution and his still striking handsomeness. Hart Crane, of course, was a homosexual and a rampant alcoholic. So
Loveman was homosexual as well, I believe.
Loveman was too. There was another. We'll talk about Robert Barlow. A fair amount of how. This is the thing. Lovecraft, he hated all these things. He spoke poor. There is instances of him speaking poorly of homosexuals and certainly of other races and Jews and all of these things. But he marries a Jew. He's friends with homosexuals. Anytime he meets somebody who's of a different race or ethnicity than him, he's eminently polite.
Yeah.
It's like it's all happening in his head. You know what I mean? It's not. It's almost like it's not real. In real life, he's just a normal
monster.
person.
But some kind of a monster in his own mind.
Right.
A minotaur. He's in his own maze, his own hell in his brain.
Yeah. So,
no chill. The dude had no chill.
Nope.
No.
Now, except for the poikilothermism, because
right.
Except for he's literally a lizard. A weird lizard Lovecraft, licking his lips, warming his fingers over a candle.
So in 1919, he enters what I would consider to be like another sort of shutdown, withdrawal, period in which he will regenerate from. This is in 1919. His mother has a breakdown. Let's see. Okay, so as she's approaching this breakdown, she brings in Lovecraft's aunt, who is only 13 years older than him. So, that's not that crazy of a difference. You're 20, whatever, 19, you're 29, she's in her early 40s. You're of the similar age. When I first read this, I kept thinking of these like old crones looking over him, but it's really not the case. She just kind of came to live with him and kind of keep house as Susie was breaking down, because Lovecraft was living with Susie. Annie, just to give you kind of a little detail about Annie, because Lovecraft would live with her for a long time, she'd been married to this newspaper man. They'd had 2 kids. One of them died in infancy, and the other had tuberculosis. So they had moved to somewhere in Colorado. When that son died at the age of 18, Annie, Lovecraft's aunt, moves back in with Susie Lovecraft and Hp Lovecraft. When Susie dies, now Annie is basically keeping house for HP, which I think it's funny. You've got this guy. It'd be one thing if he was like some kind of like industrialist and he was out working all the time and he had a child and then, his wife died. Then there's something that makes sense in this more traditional culture of, okay, well, the spinster aunt comes and lives with you and takes care of house, but you're just a neat sit in your room reading books. Like you don't need your aunt to come take care of you. You're like almost 30 years old.
Yeah.
It's kind of pathetic.
Painting the whole picture. Yeah.
Right.
What is he doing for money? Is this all inheritance now?
Most of it's all inheritance. He's gradually starting to pick up some ghostwriting and editing work, but not much at this time in the like 1919, 1920. It's basically living off of inheritance. He would never really have like a full-time job. He would have like he would have gigs in ghostwriting, and we'll get into a couple of the other things that he did for work. But he was a gentleman. So gentlemen don't work, right?
He was
even if you're dead broke. Yeah,
he didn't even actually consider writing to be work per se.
Yeah.
He actually wrote in a letter to a friend that writing is not a suitable occupation for a gentleman. So here we just have another case where he just flagrantly contradicts his own beliefs. His writings to his friends.
Yeah. He's willing to give up everything to be to be a gentleman. But the thing he spends a lot of his time doing is it's paradox upon paradox upon paradox for sure. In 1919, Susie Lovecraft, his mother, is admitted to the same hospital that his father was admitted to. So 1919, Lovecraft is 29 years of age. By mid-1921, Susie dies, apparently some complications. She'd had a gallbladder surgery, and there were some complications related to that, and she passed away. Following which, Lovecraft would live with one or both of his aunts for basically the rest of his life, or at least the rest of their lives, despite some traveling in a couple of years with Sonia, which we're going to talk about in a second. I think there's this interesting period. So Lovecraft is starting to kind of break out and deal in this amateur journalism world. He's kind of going to some meetings and things like that, leaving Providence. His mother is on her way out. After she is institutionalized, he has a very depressive period, similar to the reclusive years right after high school, but shorter in duration. Well, we also, I want to back up for a second. I know it's a little out of order, but I think it's crucial to get the last little taste of what Susie was like. This is what 1918's World War I, right? This is what when Lovecraft tried to sign up for World War I to go fight, this is what happened. Okay, so this is around 1917, actually. Oppressed by his uselessness, Lovecraft made one serious effort to escape his mother's coddling. On April 6, 1917, so he would have been 27, the United States declared war on the German Empire. The next month, Lovecraft applied for enlistment in the National Guard. He passed the cursory physical explanation by keeping his mouth shut about his medical history and was accepted as a private in the Coast Artillery. When Susie Lovecraft heard, she was prostrated by the news. There were scenes, and she and the family physician persuaded the army to annul the enlistment. When conscription loomed, Lovecraft wrote, quote, "My mother has threatened to go to any lengths, legal or otherwise, if I do not reveal all the ills which unfit me for the army."
Oh, I'm fainting. Oh,
right.
You can't send my boy to fight the Krauts.
Right.
Yeah. That is a vibe, man.
Yeah.
Mommy got him out of World War I.
He was literally signed up to go, and he's 27 years old, and his mom got him out of it. Right.
Wow.
So, and I understand the mother not wanting the son to go. That's a normal feeling, I think.
But being so vocal about it that you're able to get the military to say, yeah, we don't want him.
Right.
That is,
Can you imagine
that phrase that she used, go to any lengths, legal or otherwise, it almost sounds to me like she's threatening self-harm or something. If he goes.
Yeah, like who knows what histrionics were involved in this,
right.
Right. It was,
that makes Saving Private Ryan a very short movie.
Right. So mom just doesn't
you don't even get out of the first act.
Yeah, it's just they're listening to it's Private Ryan sitting at home listening to it on the radio.
Yeah, with his brothers.
With his brothers. No, okay, so that was 1917, and I kind of skipped back, but I feel like that was an important note to hit because Susie dies. Lovecraft goes into a bit of a depression, but at the same time, he's still got this amateur journalism thing. He's got that world that he's participating in, and he is starting to write more fiction, and his fiction is becoming more in the vein of what we think of as Lovecraftian. I think the story that he writes in 1921, The Music of Eric Zahn, is not quite a Cthulhu story, but it is definitely Lovecraftian. It's one of my favorites, actually.
Music of Eric Zahn is a fantastic story. It's about, do you want to do it, Brad, or I can?
No, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially because Lovecraft, as far as we know, didn't have any particular interest in music beyond just like listening to opera and classical, sort of in a dilettantish way. But The story is about a musician who's sort of locked up in a attic room, and he plays this wild sort of Stravinsky-ish violin music night after night, and nobody knows why or what's going on. And the protagonist finally manages to sit for a night with the musician while he plays, and it turns out, of course, that there are these horrifying elder god cosmic forces trying to break into our dimension, and by playing this wild music, this man is able to keep the evil forces at bay. And this is we're starting to see, as with the story Dagon and Beyond the Wall of Sleep that we talked about earlier, we're seeing the germs, we're seeing the seeds, the motifs, the elements of the Cthulhu mythos starting to pop up.
Absolutely, and yeah, that's a good one. Dagon and Music of Eric Zahn, I think, are two in the biographical work we've done so far. I would say those are two. It's worth reading any of this stuff, but I think those are two highlights thus far in Lovecraft up to 1921.
He's also writing a lot of the stories of what are going to later be known as the dream cycle stories. These are stories that are in imitation of Lord Dunsany, who we talked about earlier. They're stories that are set in Lovecraft's own, by his own account, set in his actual lucid dream world, which is apparently consistent from dream to dream. It has a consistent geography, consistent inhabitants. There are sentient cats there who protect places. Lovecraft likes cats a lot.
There's N-word man, and S-word man,
and his army of sentient cats. The night gaunts, the black latex tickle torture monsters are there. And he's going to write a whole series of stories that are set in this dream world, which don't receive as much attention as the Cthulhu mythos stories, but I really think they're two sides of the same coin. And there, as we'll get into later, there really is a lot of interplay between the two cycles of stories.
Now, so one big thing really draws Lovecraft into this next phase. His mother dying, or being committed first and then dying second, and then Lovecraft meets a woman. So he is in Boston. He is at this amateur journalism event, and he gives a speech. And I think this is really kind of heartwarming. He gives a speech in response to the question of what amateur journalism. The question that he was supposed to be responding to is what you have done for amateur journalism, and what has amateur journalism done for you. And I think this is really sort of touching about Lovecraft's perspective on this. There's more to it than this. This is just an excerpt. Happily, I can be less reserved in stating what amateurdom has done for me. Amateur journalism has provided me with the very world in which I live. Of a nervous and reserved temperament, and cursed with an aspiration which far exceeds my endowments, I am a typical misfit in the larger world of endeavor. In 1914, when the kindly hand of amateurdom was first extended to me, I was as close to the state of vegetation as any animal well can be. Perhaps I might have best been compared to the lowly potato. What amateurdom has brought me is a circle of persons among whom I am not altogether an alien, persons who possess scholastic leanings, yet who are not as a body so arrogant with achievement that a straggler is frowned upon. What I have given amateur journalism is regrettably little. What amateur journalism has given me is life itself. Right? So clearly he knows, how important this world has been. It's a lifeline, really, for him, this world. It allows him to tap into a social milieu that he wouldn't have otherwise. We were kind of talking about what it means in this age. He sort of missed out on that college or young person experience that a lot of people might have, and this is his alternative for it. And he recognized that, I think. He also, that same night that he gives that speech, he meets Sonia Green, the woman who would become his wife. Now,
lads, if you want to meet a lovely young lady, put yourself in a position to do some public speaking.
Right.
It's never
true.
A bad idea. It really is.
It doesn't hurt. Yeah.
You're going to get over a lot of anxiety. You're going to show a bit of confidence. It tends to get noticed. Even a complete bonkers freak like I'm just going to go out and say it. Even a complete bizarro, the strangest figure that we've covered, and despicable person There is a port for every storm.
The Hp Lovecraft PUA method.
Yeah,
Right
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's just something about it.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, well, and this is the question, right? So as I'm reading this, and I had kind of known going into it, there's allusions to and I knew this actually before even doing the research, that he was married, that there was this marriage, and I thought as I've been reading this book and getting to his biographical material, which I wasn't that familiar with before we decided to do this episode, I was starting to think like, who is gonna he's got this withdrawn, weird personality. He's steeply racist. He's not only unemployed, but he's unemployable. He's an incel. He's a NEET. He's a nerd. He's a mama's boy. He's all of these things. He really genuinely is these things, despite the fact that, he's a literary genius who hasn't quite shown that yet at this point in his life. Who would want to be, who wants to be with this guy, right? What kind of person is this? It turns out that Sonia Green is amazing. She's an amazing woman.
She can save him.
Exactly.
The rest of this episode, I am hinging my entire hope on the idea that Ms. Green can come in and help.
She certainly helped. She will try.
She will do more than any human being could be expected to do for any other human being. We can say that.
Yeah. I think that's true. Samuel,
I want to flag.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I want to flag. We are going into our third hour now of HPL.
Oh yeah, you're right.
We're going to be heading into it here shortly. I am going to continue listening, but I'm going to go top off a little bit of water. I also think, gentlemen, if at some juncture, if you need to stand up for 90 seconds, the other two can sort of vamp as we go, because it's going to, we are going long. We are going hard. We are going dark. HP
I warned you.
I
warned you guys.
Just stood up and he gave a public speech, and he's attracted the eye of a nice Jewish girl.
A nice Jewish girl. Yeah.
All right. Let's go.
Yeah. So Samuel Loveman, Lovecraft's good friend, would describe her as one of the most beautiful women I have ever met, and the kindest. Okay. Now, the one thing here is she is 7 years older than Lovecraft, right? Which is kind of substantial.
And she's a divorcee, worth mentioning.
She's a divorcee, right? With a child. She had one child and then one who had passed away, I believe. She was a Ukrainian. She was born in Ukraine. She was a Jew born in Ukraine in 1883. She'd moved to the United States when she was 9 years old, to Elmira, New York, which paradoxically is where Mark Twain was born. Where his body is, where you can go see the Mark Twain grave, which I actually did one time. I had a friend take me there, and I didn't believe them that Mark Twain's grave was there, but it is. She had been married once before, as we said. She was kind of a powerhouse businesswoman, especially considering the time that she was in. She was a hat designer. She would own more than one boutique throughout her career, to varying levels of success. She was
a girl boss.
Yeah. She was a girl boss, especially at this time, 1920s, and she's owning a business. It's pretty amazing. And especially it wasn't sort of given to her. She wasn't the heir to a business. She started it herself. So, she didn't quite reach the levels of what we might call independently wealthy, but she, most of the time she could take care of herself, which, is important.
For sure.
They had this charming kind of dating thing, her and HPL, where they would go on, I think Howard Lovecraft, Hp Lovecraft. I think his idea of a good time with another person was to go on an antiquarian walking tour. I think that held more appeal to him than basically any other activity you could do with another person.
And she adapted. She pursued him quite a lot. He was shy. He was pretty reticent. And she basically would put in the time and the energy. I've never quite understood exactly what it was that she saw in him, but apparently it was something that she really wanted, because she put in the time to figure out, like you said, that he liked antiquarian walks. He loved to go to the cemetery and look at the dates on the gravestones and try to find the oldest ones and trace the family's names. And she did it. She went and wept. She went on graveyard walks with him, and those were their dates, and she was happy to do it.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
And then, so eventually she would, I think like their first kiss, and his first kiss in life was something like she had written something and he read it and gave her got very excited about it or something. It was a very literary kind of thing. It had something to do with, I think, something she had written. He got very excited and she sort of impulsively kissed him and he sort of got all bashful about it. Right. Now they would get married. They did get married in 1924, and he would move to New York City. He was very excited about getting married. I mean, he was like, this is the founding of a new family, and all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he moved to New York City to live with her. Yeah.
It was going to be one of the hugest shifts in his entire life, actually. So he spent his entire life in basically Providence, Rhode Island. He spent most of his life in two particular houses in Providence, Rhode Island.
And those two houses were 3 blocks away from each other.
Right, and now he's going to New York, and his first reaction to New York is he starts writing letters to his friends, and you can really see he exoticizes it. He writes about it the way that someone would write about the Orient in the Arabian Nights. He writes a letter in which he describes like the first rays of dawn coming in and hitting the harbor and sailing into Ellis Island and imagining that he can smell the far off spices from ports around the world. And you think he's describing like Constantinople in the Middle Ages or something. And he's describing sailing into Ellis Island.
Right. Yeah, no, there was a very yin yang kind of attitude he had about New York City itself, and then about his own life there. And I've got these two great in the DeCamp bio. There's these two great letter excerpts that are right next to each other about New York City that contrast each other beautifully. So the first one kind of goes with what you're saying. We'll get some of the Lovecraft kind of language. This is about New York City. Out of the waters it rose at twilight, cold, proud, beautiful, an eastern city of wonder whose brothers the mountains are. It was not like any city of earth, for above purple mists rose towers, spires, and pyramids, which one may only dream of in opiate lands beyond the Oxus, right? I don't even know what the Oxus is, but...
It's a range of mountains in Turkmenistan.
Is that what it is? Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Ben coming in hot.
River in Turkmenistan. Sorry,
Ben has probably been there. The one thing we missed in his intro is that Ben is one of the most well-traveled people that I have ever met.
I've been in 40 countries, but have not been in Turkmenistan.
Okay. Now here's the flip side. So that's his love letter to New York City. Here's the other side, talking about visiting the slums of the Lower East Side. These swine have instinctive swarming movements, a bastard mess of stewing mongrel flesh without intellect, repellent to eye, nose, and imagination. Would to heaven a kindly gust of cyanogen could asphyxiate the whole gigantic abortion, end the misery, and clean out the place. So that's the other side of New York City for Lovecraft.
Yeah, just to really underline this, that's Lovecraft talking about killing other ethnicities with toxic gas.
Oh, yes.
Just to be very clear that's what he's saying.
Come across, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So one thing I do want to mention, those two letters are from two different. The first one is from when he's first arriving in New York.
Yes.
The second one is after he and Sonia have been there for, I think, 4 years, or Sonia eventually moves away, and Lovecraft has some disastrous experiences, one of which is that he has to try and, Sonia loses her job, and she's jobless for a little while. Lovecraft says, I'm going to go out and I'm going to be the breadwinner and find a job. And Lovecraft embarks on what may well be the worst job search in human history. Like if you gave me like a Nathan For You episode and said like do the worst job search you possibly can, I couldn't do a job search as bad as Hp Lovecraft does his job search.
It's hilarious.
He goes to employers. He tells employers that they're not his first choice. He applies for positions that he's wildly underqualified for. He shows up to interviews and speaks in his antiquarian, English prose language, which you can only imagine how this goes over in Manhattan in the 1920s. Lovecraft showing up in his starched collars and his uncle's 19th century suits, talking about being a country gentleman.
And he has no job experience either. He's like a 30-something-year-old man with no job experience. So
zero. He's never worked behind a counter in his life.
Right. Now I'm going to give you a quick. This is from the. You guys know how to pronounce this. I always make it sound terrible. Huebeck.
Welbeck.
Okay. All right. I'm not even going to try. Okay. This is from that book, but it's a Lovecraft excerpt, an excerpt from a Lovecraft letter that he apparently wrote to an employer. This would be like a cover letter. The notion that not even a man of cultivation and good intelligence can possibly acquire rapid effectiveness in a field ever so slightly outside his own routine would seem to be a naive one. Yet recent events have shown me most emphatically what a widespread superstition it is. Since commencing 2 months ago, a quest for work for which I am naturally and scholastically well fitted, I have answered nearly 100 advertisements without gaining so much as one chance for satisfactory hearing. And all, apparently, because I cannot point to previous employment in the precise industrial subdivision represented by the various firms. Faring thus with the usual channels, I am at last experimentally taking the aggressive. So that was in a letter. That was part of a cover letter that Lovecraft wrote to one of his prospective employers. You can just see they were like, "Who is this weirdo?" Like, no.
Yeah, this guy is going to be a problem. He is not going to show up on time. If he does show up on time, we're going to wish he hadn't. It's going to be an issue.
Right.
So he sort of works his way down the ladder to the point where he's applying for like stockroom positions. He can't even find that. He can't get anything. He ultimately can't find it. Nobody will hire him. And he begins to sell his belongings. And this is the point where Sonia is like, red flag, and she decides to go out. And I do think before
Cleveland, right? After a couple years in New York City with them, she went to Cleveland.
She finds another job in Cleveland. Lovecraft doesn't want to accompany her there and who can blame him? It's Cleveland. Not sorry, Cleveland. But Lovecraft doesn't want to go there. And
guys, you can't do this. This is a podcast. We've got Rhode Island now. We've got Cleveland. I am not. I disavow. I disavow the cat name. I disavow so much of this episode.
One thing that I do think is worth touching on is that he and Sonia actually do they make a go of it love life-wise in this period. The only thing that contrary to the rumors that he's asexual, she describes him as satisfactory in bed, which is,
that's high praise.
Not 5 stars, but, apparently
it's frankly better than I would have expected from Lovecraft, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to read a love letter that he wrote to her. This is
awesome.
After their divorce, she would burn most of the correspondence that the two of them had. But this is a love letter that was somehow preserved. And this is what he wrote to her in the heat of passion. Dear Mrs. Green, the reciprocal love of a man and a woman is an experience of the imagination which consists of attributing to its subject a certain particular relation with the aesthetico-emotional life of that which feels it, and depends on particular conditions which must be fulfilled by that object. With long years of mutual enduring, love slowly comes adaptation and a perfect relationship. Memories, dreams, delicate stimuli, aesthetics, and habitual impressions of beauty of dreams become permanent modifications thanks to the influence of each upon the other. There is one considerable difference between the sentiments of youth and those of maturity. Around 40 or maybe 50 years old, a complete change takes place. Love exceeds to a profound calm and serenity, founded on a tender association, before which the erotic infatuation of youth has a certain mediocre and humiliating aspect. Youth brings with it erogenous and imaginary stimuli based on the tactile phenomena of slender bodies in virginal attitudes, and on the visual imagery of classical aesthetic contours symbolizing a sort of freshness and springtime immaturity which is very beautiful, but which has nothing to do with conjugal love. That is Lovecraft in the heat of passion writing.
I mean, I was swooning. I was swooning when you read that.
He sounds like he's dissecting a frog or some sort of an animal. It's really this is a far cry from Joyce's.
Well, yes, they're opposite ends of the spectrum. That's for sure.
Yeah, keyword is spectrum here, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the many. I've heard spectrum. I've heard schizophrenic. I've heard psychopath, sociopath. Yeah. I've heard them all. Who knows? You know,
it's hard to think.
Once again, you just threw me a curveball. That's a new style of prose from him.
Right.
Yeah.
I haven't even. Yeah. Oh God, yeah. That's a love letter. Okay.
Right. Yep. Right. Yeah.
All
so we'll. Yeah. So the marriage with Sony ultimately doesn't work. Right. Obviously, I think they would eventually agree to. He would move back. I think I had in my notes, and I could be wrong, but I think he moves back to Providence after a little over 2 years. Now he does have a lot of this is a very social time period for him in New York City because there's a lot more people around in Providence than there were in Providence, right?
Sonia continues to pay his rent, by the way. Sonia moves to Cleveland. She's hustling. She's paying for herself and her kid, and she's footing the bill for Lovecraft's rent in New York.
Right.
You hear these stories of these guys. I'll never understand how that happens.
Mm-hmm.
It would be so anathema to me.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just silly. Maybe I should have tried it at some point. I just can't imagine. But again, that puts him in another. It just is helping. You're shading in my understanding of who this is. Mommy is still looking after him.
Oh well, this is the thing. When he lived in New York City, he would still have his aunts send him dispersals from like the estate or whatever, or the trust or however that worked, right? They would like send him a check every month, like an allowance. And when he got checks for writing from Weird Tales and from other sources, he would mail the checks up to Providence for his aunts to take care of. And if, say, when he was living in New York, say his shoes needed to be cobbled or he needed a pair of pants mended, he would mail those to Providence, have his aunts take care of it, and they would mail it back. Right. This is a 38-year-old man at this point, or 30, or mid 30-year-old man.
Sure.
Not 38, but 35.
I'm going to tell you what, I kind of like him. I like it. He's pursuing his craft, his art.
Yeah.
He's awful. He's horrible.
Yeah, right.
But I kind of, there's a certain kind of a weird, almost like a localism to him, even though he's living in New York. He's still.
He loved Providence.
Would he go back? He must have gone back frequently.
He went back. Yeah. Right. No. So he went after. He probably traveled when he lived in New York City. He probably traveled up. But he definitely moved back to Providence after this couple of years in New York. He loved Providence. He loved the old buildings. He loved like the colonialism, like Victorian like architecture for a long time was too recent for him. That was like, and it's.
He would actually at one point say, "I am Providence."
Yes,
I believe that's actually on his tombstone.
I think it is too. Yeah, he loved it. And he would take friends that would come visit him. He would take them on tours and like, where else but in Providence can you find? And he would just like show them like a bank, or whatever.
I know a few people. I've met a few people that are like that.
They just love the place they're from,
and they know every street and every family name, and maybe not every, but they know a lot. Yeah, I kind of admire that. That's something that I feel like we've lost a little bit, and Mm-hmm. I like this. Is that really on his tombstone? I am Providence.
It is.
Wow.
Yep. I've been there. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he definitely goes back to Providence. Now, the one thing that happens in New York City is the racism, I think, really ramps up.
Yeah.
And he would have some later experiences that are going to temper this, which we'll talk about. But I think there's a couple of things going on here. His own inability to get a job or find a job or take care of himself. I think despite the fact that he leaned on it, I think there's some indication that it was a little bit embarrassing. And he did try to get a job. He just was terrible at it. And then you've got these, from his perspective, these hordes of, people that have such mixed whatever that he can't even identify them. They're coming in, they're having the American dream kind of thing happen. Right. And so I think this all turned his racism up. And also he was out of his element. He felt alienated and all of these things. I think this really cranked up the knob.
I think it shifts. it shifts the tone of the racism. It goes from your garden variety, New England, I've never met a black person, casual racism, to he begins to describe like seeing the smells of like the foreign cooking and the smells of the quote unquote Negro bodies and things like this on the streets, the smells and the sounds of them like hooting like apes on the subway. He begins to use this kind of imagery. It's like a visceral physical revulsion at other ethnicities that begins to come out of him.
Yeah, let me give you, because this is actually, I don't even want to say this, but this is like pure Lovecraftian prose style, but in this milieu of racial just hatred. Okay. This is from a letter that he wrote to his friend Frank Belknap Long. The organic things, Italo-Semitico-Mongoloid, inhabiting that awful cesspool could not by any stretch of the imagination be called human. They were monstrous and nebulous adumbrations of the pithecanthropoid and amoebal, vaguely molded from some stinking viscous slime of Earth's corruption and slithering and oozing in and on the filthy streets or in and out of windows and doorways in a fashion suggestive of nothing but infesting worms or deep-sea unnamabilities. So, yeah,
we are well beyond the level of hanging out with the boys and cracking jokes here.
This isn't cracking the occasional sort of shocker joke or whatever.
Right.
Or
even among you have your Italian friend and you got your Italian jokes.
Right.
This is some next level. Not that you would have an Italian friend, but I mean, I'm saying if you did, of course I'm joking. Yeah, but you get my point. It's like we're well beyond the level of japery.
Right,
this is real. This is existential. This is disgusting.
Absolutely.
They're not human, and I'm going to say they're not human. That's
right.
Go on.
And the thing is, when you start to think about what his fiction then becomes, because he hasn't written the Call of Cthulhu yet. He hasn't written some of these, and you think about that he's writing about when he's living in New York City, and then you think about the work that's to come. You can't, to my mind, you can't totally unwind those two things from each other. I don't think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yet, weirdly, this is, despite all of this revulsion at these other ethnic groups, this is still the same guy who remains and will remain to the end of his life fascinated with the Orient, the East, the sunlight on the minarets and the deserts of Arabia and all this. So it's the puzzle pieces that just don't seem to come from the same puzzle.
Well, I can understand. Yeah, go on.
Well, I every time he encounters he actually encounters people on a personal basis that are from some, the first Jewish woman he meets, he marries. He meets some French Canadians later in a trip to Canada and is like, these people are amazing. He meets some Cubans in Florida later. He's like, I have to go to Cuba. Like, he's not, as soon as he actually encounters any of these people in a way that's not just being overwhelmed by it, like, anybody, you can imagine if you're from Providence and you show up in New York City and you go to the most hectic, crazy, slummy place in the city,
and it smells like
be a little
urine, and at this point they're probably still dumping their waste in the streets more than they still do. Right. I'm not going to run cover for Hp Lovecraft's awfulness, but if I do try to be somewhat sympathetic, like, it's probably somebody who's way too sensitive, way too high on his own horse, never got a punch in the face like he probably should have, was coddled, and goes to a city where they're not giving you room in New York City. And I guarantee they weren't then, and they still don't. You got to fight for every inch, and you got to fight for your spot on the subway, and they're not going to make it comfortable for a little dandy boy like him. Right. And this probably comes out as a kind of narcissistic rage, which he turns on the other. Yeah. So in a way, it's kind of pathetic. It's a little pitiable, but at the same time, like, it's maybe marginally different from somebody who's from some small Midwestern town and who comes back and just says, I could never live in New York City. But yet he somehow lives there for a number of years. So interesting. Strange guy.
Like you say, though, yeah, it's hard not to wonder, like, what might have happened if he did get a blue collar job, hauling barrels in a warehouse somewhere and had to work with Cubans, or if he hadn't had that luxury of having this woman who's willing to write the checks for the rent, and he sit up in his ivory tower writing racial, white supremacist rhetoric all day. If he actually had to get down there and work with these people, he might have formed a very different opinion. So
I think he probably would have. Yeah. Want to give one kind of final note on the Sonia marriage, which does end. This is later. She outlived him, and this is sort of the eulogy, not that she gave at his wedding, but just I think in a letter that she wrote. Sonia said, "I believed he loved me as much as it was possible for a temperament like his to love. He'd never mention the word love. He would say, 'My dear, you don't know how much I appreciate you.' I tried to understand him and was grateful for any crumbs from his lips that fell my way. I saw in Howard a Socratic wisdom and genius. I had hoped in time to humanize him further, to lift him out of his abysmal depths of loneliness and psychic complexes by the true wedded love. I'm afraid my optimism and excessive self-assurance misled us both."
And he was such a good public speaker.
He was.
I was sure that I could save him. She was having the I could save him impulse.
Yeah.
That can, boy, if you want to get wrecked, that is a thing to get wrecked on, and that cuts in all directions. Mm-hmm.
And for a time, it looked like she might actually be succeeding. His friends who came to visit him in New York were absolutely shocked because they came to visit him. Had people who had seen him in Providence shuffling around the house in his dressing gown, pretending to be old Uncle Theobald. They came and saw him in New York, and he's giving dinner parties. He and Sonia are going out to the theater. Like there's one, actually, if you Google image search for Hp Lovecraft photos, there's one picture of him where he's actually smiling. And it was taken of him when he was in New York. It's like, and it stands out from all the others Hp Lovecraft author photos. You're like, it's downright weird. It's like Lovecraft smiling into the camera, and you're like, this is a guy who's actually having fun.
Yeah, he was having a good time. Yeah. And he did have moments, I think, that were fun in New York. And he definitely made friends. He made friends that he would visit throughout the rest of his life, even after he moved back to Providence. One thing that does come out too in this period, the New York period, and then more of it after his move back to Providence, is he gets his first piece published in Weird Tales. They publish, I think the first story they publish is The Hound, if I'm not mistaken.
I have always loved the name of that magazine.
Oh, it's
Weird
great.
Tales. Whoa.
Yeah.
What a great, I want to go get my penny and run down to the corner store for the newest copy of Weird Tales.
Yes.
And you really have to set the cultural context for this too, because this is mid 1920s. There really is no such thing as modern science fiction, modern fantasy, modern horror. I mean, there's some horror stuff floating around, Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker's Dracula, this kind of stuff. But Weird Tales is the flagship magazine of the genre of weird fiction, which is really something that's qualitatively different from all those other genres, in that it may have monsters, it may have fantasy elements, it may take place on other worlds, but rather than trying to provoke horror or revulsion, the Weird Tales' primary purpose is to awaken emotions of awe and wonder. And this is the sort of manifesto or MO for the weird fiction genre, really right down. It's still an active genre and an active community that I participate in as a writer to this day. And it's the genre that Lovecraft really is going to come to define by writing these stories that they feel sort of like sci-fi sometimes they feel like fantasy, sometimes they feel like horror. I think a lot of people today would consider him a horror author, but he's none of these. He's a weird fiction author, and that's reflected in the name of the magazine, Weird Tales. That's going to bring him a lot of reputability during his lifetime.
And so the first story comes out in like 1924, The Hound, and then through he would appear for 2 or 3 years. He would appear in almost every every issue of Weird Tales. He would have a story in it, and with gradually making a little bit more money each time, gradually getting a little bit more acclaim each time, right? Until eventually you see Call of Cthulhu in there, and some of his bigger works. And I want to dwell on that more and spend more time, because now we're getting into 1924, 1926 and on. We're getting into the sort of the great texts period of Lovecraft. One thing I want to hit on before that, though, is talking about his ghostwriting and editing. One of the most interesting things is he ghost wrote at least one story, if not more, for Harry Houdini, of all people, which is, I think, is fascinating. Just imagining the two. I don't even know if the two of them met in person. I think they actually did at least once. But he wrote a Harry Houdini. It was like a Harry Houdini caper story that Harry Houdini had kind of come up with about getting captured by some Arabs at the Sphinx, I believe, and lowered into like a chamber of unnameable horrors.
Was it like a commission? It was a commission.
Yeah, no, it would go under the byline of Harry Houdini, but Lovecraft wrote it.
Oh, he ghost wrote it.
Ghost wrote it.
Okay. Yeah, so it would have been
Houdini's concept for the story was I was imprisoned underneath the Sphinx and I had to escape. And then Lovecraft takes this and he turns it into a Lovecraft story. And there's, unnameable squelching things with hippopotamus heads in the darkness, and it goes on from there.
I love it. I love it. Now, so that was probably the most noteworty of his ghostwriting clients. He would have others who were not so well known, and he would have others where
what did Houdini sound like? Hey, I don't even know he would do it. Hey, HP, give me some of that weird fiction. Right. some of those weird tales. I wish I could do that kind of mid-Atlantic period accent.
Right.
Yeah, that's so funny.
Probably both. Well, I think Houdini was actually like a Hungarian or something.
Oh, right. Of course, it'd be a different accent. So. That's a different show. I'm not going to start doing accents, but I just love to imagine that meeting, and boy,
right.
No, it's
very much a time period. And he would, this is the thing, is there were other people that Lovecraft knew. Lovecraft was acquaintances with one of Charlie Chaplin's half brothers. So there's just like this strange, these people that he runs into. And then of course, eventually Robert E. Howard, he would become friends with mostly via correspondence. And then some of these other writers, Clark Ashton Smith, and that sort of thing. It's just interesting, the kind of the circle that he did end up running in because of this, and the people that he would come to know.
And this is around the period he hasn't quite started to get into the real Cthulhu mythos core stories yet. He's building up to it, but this is around the period that he's starting to attract influence, and younger writers are starting to write into him, expressing interest in the stuff that he's written, saying, "Can I borrow such and such element for my own?" And Lovecraft is extremely solicitous. He's like, absolutely. You want to, write about something in reference to this theme that I used in my story? Absolutely, go for it. And so even though he doesn't have human protagonists or a cohesive storyline in his fiction, he's creating a world that other writers want to come and play in. And this is his influence is kind of starting to spread little by little out into the weird fiction community.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we should hit on too, 1926 or so, he writes a lengthy article. It spends like 8 months on it for his friend W. Paul Cook's amateur journal, The Recluse. What is it called? Supernatural
horror and literature. I mean, it's really a book almost. It traces the entire history of course, it really should be called supernatural horror in European literature, because that's the only kind of literature Lovecraft cares about. But it traces the origins of horrific supernatural themes, going back to the ancient, Celtic and Anglo-Saxon Germanic myths, and through the Greco-Roman period, going through Gothic romance of the Italian ghost stories, and Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker and all this kind of stuff. It talks about Arthur Machen, and Blackwood and Dunsany, who we mentioned earlier in this episode. And then, oddly enough, it kind of stops. It doesn't talk about any of Lovecraft's own contemporaries. It ends with a chapter called The Modern Masters, which is mostly about Machen and Blackwood and Dunsany, who were working in like the 1910s. And it doesn't talk about any of the writers who Lovecraft personally knew or was working with as his own contemporaries. It just kind of stops, which is kind of weird. Like it would be like making a documentary about horror fiction now and stopping at the year 2000. And you just don't write about anybody who's doing work now. So
that is interesting.
He's just like summarizing everything that's come before.
Yeah, but what I find interesting about that, and I didn't read that entire essay. I read a fair amount of it. It's well researched. Like he
Yeah.
did the work for sure. And then it also made me realize, it was like, man, at that time, had anybody written anything that in depth on that subject matter? I mean, this isn't something that was getting studied at the Ivy League institutions, right? So
Right.
this work had to be happening outside of the academy, and Lovecraft was actually doing it, right? So. Yeah, and he didn't get paid for it. This was an 8-month gentlemanly investigation into, it was very it's interesting, and it poises him as an expert in the field at that time, for sure. Not only from a scholarly standpoint, but from a practitioner standpoint.
It really gives you a lot of insight into his influences too, and what his literary world looks like at this period. It's kind of common, I think, for a lot of people who come to Lovecraft's work for the first time to see Lovecraft as this person who just sort of pops out of the void with all these tentacles and alien, and you're like, where does this come from? This has nothing to do with anything. But if you read supernatural horror and literature, Lovecraft will tell you exactly where all of this stuff comes from. It's all there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Now, as we're going a little long, and there's some things we're going to kind of skip, maybe some things, but there's a couple points that I want to hit. One thing, Ben, is, can you give me what are the big highlights? Because once 1926 happens, Lovecraft hits this pretty impressive run. He never writes a novel, but who cares, because he writes all these very long short stories and novellas. What are the handful of the must-reads in that period, 1926 and on, and give us kind of the gist of them and what people should read?
Absolutely, yeah. So just he does actually co-write a novel called The Lurker at the Threshold, which is it's not great, but it's it's there. But yeah, the core text, really, the first one of these is the Dunwich Horror, and I am going to pull up my chronological list to make sure I get these all in. Yeah. Make sure I get these all in correct order.
Because he does have a pretty impressive run, a pretty productive run.
This is after he gets back to Providence, after he writes supernatural horror and literature, and this is when he really starts doing it. So the first one is the Dunwich Horror, and that is, oh man, it's set in a fictional town called Dunwich in New England, and it's basically the story of this old sorcerer who collects a set of forbidden texts, and it's revealed later in the story has basically sired a son, or has helped a son be born with the cooperation of his wife and an entity from beyond the stars, called Yog-Sothoth, from out of space. And there have been actually 2 children born out of this union. One of which is a boy called Wilbur, who is human from the waist up and very much not human from the waist down. And then another child who is never actually seen, because it's invisible, until the climax of the story, when some professors at the university manage to find some magic powder that they can blow on this other entity, and then it's revealed what it actually is, and it's this giant creature with it's all made of like centipedes and snakes, and it has half of a man's face on top, and it looks like that moment in the story. I still remember reading it. I remember going back as a teenager, the first time I read that story, going back and reading and rereading that passage. Like I couldn't picture in my head what he's describing, and that had never happened to me in literature before. It's so unlike anything. But one thing that Welbeck points out, which I think is incredible, is that this is actually a Messiah story told in reverse. So you have the magical child born in the winter to a mother he's born of divine parentage. He becomes well-read in the sacred texts early in life and debates with the other philosophers at the university who say he's a heretic. He's pursued by the traditional scholars, mocked. He performs miracles. He reveals mysteries from beyond space and time. And then the climax of the story, the Dunwich Horror, is the other brother being pursued up to the top of the hill, revealed to be this horrific alien creature. And at the top of the hill, as this alien thing is dying, as the doctors cast curses on it and throw these potions at it, and it's dying, and it looks up to heaven, up to the stars, and it screams, "Father Yog-Sothoth, why have you forsaken me?" and as it's dying. So it is the Jesus story inverted.
Wow.
What if the Messiah came, and the Messiah came from it was someone else's Messiah. It was the elder gods Messiah. And this introduces one of the themes that's going to recur in a lot of Lovecraft stories, which is that the heroes never really win. If they make it out with their lives, they're lucky. If they make it out with their lives and their sanity, they're extraordinarily lucky. That is the best they can ever hope for. Nothing's ever defeated.
Right. You never get the girl. You never get the prize.
Yeah, you never
save the day.
That's the thing that I always remember about the tabletop HP Lovecraft Cthulhu games is that you're always rolling sanity checks.
Yes.
Your character's going to go mad at some point, and you get to LARP that. So, not unlike being a podcaster.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
That's right.
So I'm going to backtrack here because I actually did miss a couple that I want to hit. The first really story of the mythos is the Call of Cthulhu. That one he writes in 1926. That one opens with a dream. And this actually comes out of Lovecraft had what was called a commonplace book, which was a notebook where he wrote down his story ideas, sort of his trapper keeper. And he would he had this story idea that was he wanted to write a story about an artist who sees an image of an idol in a dream, some pre-human idol of some alien race, and then sculpts the idol out of clay, and then takes the idol and shows it to an art professor or an archaeologist, and the art professor or the archaeologist is shocked and horrified because it looks it's an exact duplicate of some 10,000-year-old idol that was excavated in some excavation from a primeval human sacrifice cult. That was the image that started the story for Lovecraft. So we come back to the theme of that this all started from dreams. The first time we encounter Cthulhu, the idea of Cthulhu, is in a dream. And dreams are extraordinarily important to Lovecraft, and they're going to continue to be important throughout the rest of this work. So the Call of Cthulhu, then it's told from the perspective of a guy who's digging through his uncle's letters and finds these references to these various people who have encountered the Cthulhu cult in various ways. The first one being this artist, as I just described, who showed the statue to the archaeologist, and the archaeologist was terrified. The archaeologist takes the statue, then it's documented in more of the letters, to a meeting of the Archaeological Society, and some of the archaeologists start saying, oh, wait, I've seen something like that too, but in some totally other context. There was this degenerate tribe of Inuit Eskimo people somewhere way up in the Great White North, and they practice human sacrifice, and they have an idol like this. And this is another theme that we're going to continue to see throughout Lovecraft's core mythos stories, is some weird thing, some weird object appears, and nobody can explain it or what its context is, and then it's like somebody else says, oh wait, I've seen that thing, but it's from another culture 10,000 years older, and somebody else, oh, I've seen that thing, but we dug it up on a moon of Jupiter, and
right. That's how you build it. That's real. That's world building, right? That's like that's how you because then all of a sudden the gap between those two things is totally filled. Finding it in Inuit culture and finding it in Louisiana, and suddenly your mind just fills in those blanks with unspeakable horrors.
Exactly, right. And another person at that meeting is a policeman who's just broken up a human sacrifice cult in Louisiana that was deep in the swamp where they were also worshiping this same idol. And then the final section of the story is that there is a Norwegian sea captain who recounts a story that he actually sailed to, because up to this point in the story, you're basically thinking Cthulhu is a primitive god. It's something that people worshipped. But then this Norwegian sea captain reveals the ultimate horror of the story is that Cthulhu actually is a real physical being. Cthulhu actually literally lives on Earth now, and is asleep. But if you sail to his island, you can wake him up. He looks like a dragon with an octopus for a head. Everybody knows what Cthulhu looks like, and Lovecraft will actually take some flack for this. The fact that when the monster is revealed, it actually doesn't really seem all that creative. It's like you just took a dragon and put an octopus on its head. And Lovecraft will never repeat this mistake again. Every other thing that he's going to introduce you to from this point on is going to be weirder. Every story is going to be weirder than the one before. Every monster is going to be weirder than the one before. That's the Call of Cthulhu. Another one, The Color Out of Space, that comes out in 1927. This is widely considered one of his best, if not his best. It's about a meteor that crashes into a well on a farm and begins to turn everything on the farm into some kind of alien organism. It's if you've seen the movie Annihilation, it's basically Annihilation set in the 1920s. It's the deeper into this place, the people go into the farm, and the deeper in you go, the weirder things get, the more things are hybridizing with each other, and then ultimately you get to the well itself, and there's really no explanation. It's if you survive, you're lucky. What was it? We don't know. It was a color that came out of space. We have no idea. So that's The Color Out of Space. Then 1928, The Dunwich Horror, which I talked about before. Then The Whisperer in Darkness, this is a story about a scientist who's corresponding with a friend of his who claims that he has been in contact with aliens. And the aliens are sort of crab-like insectoid beings who fly on membranous wings across the cosmos. And the nature of this guy's contact with the aliens, it's not like he's been, taken up into a spaceship and probed or something. This is a very Lovecraftian touch. What the aliens have been doing, they've been coming to his house in the darkness and whispering facts about the cosmos and the true nature of reality that are so terrifying, they're driving this man insane. Yeah, that's what's been happening. That's why it's called The Whisper. That's why it's called The Whisperer in Darkness. Yeah. And then the protagonist or the narrator finally manages to get a train. He goes to visit this scientist who's been terrified by all these things. And then the name of the story, The Whisperer in Darkness, takes on a second meaning, because when he goes to meet the guy, the room is all dark. In the room where this person that he's gone to visit is sitting is all dark, and the only thing that he can do is sit in a chair and listen to this guy whisper to him out of the shadows again. So it's this very, very creepy image of, like, you're just sitting, you've gone to visit this person, you're supposed to be saving him from some kind of alien horror, and when you get there, he's just like sitting in the shadows, draped in robes in the darkness, whispering to you of these cosmic mysteries, and issues an invitation to you to come and visit the realms beyond the stars.
That was what it was like the last time Kevin visited me.
Yeah,
it was just sort of in the darkness. Yeah,
yeah.
And
when we finally do our Art of Darkness meetup, it is going to be Lovecraft themed.
Yeah,
I surely hope so.
Well, I think we'll let Ben MC. Yeah, go on, Ben.
Go.
You are crushing this.
Yes.
You know what this is like? This is like the great montage in the sort of the midpoint of Scarface, where suddenly he goes from being the schlubby assassin to Tony Montana.
Yes,
I can feel
this is happening for Lovecraft.
Yeah, this is Lovecraft is pushing it to the limit right here.
Yeah. So The Whisperer in Darkness continues to. Also, I think it's worth mentioning here that this has got to be some sort of a callback to when Lovecraft's friends would come and visit him during a breakdown. Right? He can't get out of bed. He's sitting in his bathrobe. He won't speak above a whisper, and the only thing that he'll talk about is horrific mysteries from beyond the stars and his dream world. So it's and so that's The Whisperer in Darkness. There's a final revelation at the end of the story, which I won't spoil. It's great. It's a banger of a weird tale. Absolutely worth reading.
Cool.
The next one after that, 1931, At the Mountains of Madness. This is a proper novella. This is like 50,000 words. This is a story about an expedition who go into Antarctica, into the center of Antarctica. And Lovecraft maps this out with longitude and latitude. That's how precise he is. He lists the supplies that are in each plane and dog cart. He maps out the entire journey, latitude and longitude, with landmarks, so you could actually trace it on a map. They go into the center of Antarctica, past this huge mountain range that's taller than the Himalayas, and they find there a city. And this city is dated to be 500 million years old, which, to put this in context for you, that's 5 times older than the Jurassic period. This is back to the Cambrian explosion. This is invertebrate period. A city, a cyclopean city in Antarctica, dating from the time when the most advanced life on Earth was invertebrates. And they go in. Of course, they have to go in. They go into the city, and they find there engravings, bas-reliefs documenting the entire history of the civilization that lived there. They were a different kind of race. They were sort of half fungoids with heads that looked like starfish. They had tentacles that they crawled on coming out of the base. And they had this race or species of beings called Shoggoths, which were basically like giant amoebas, which served them. And it turns out, it's revealed as they continue to investigate the ruins and go deeper and deeper, that this alien race actually engineered all life on Earth. And the reason that they engineered all life on Earth was for food. And this includes mankind.
I'm going to do a little heavy metal guitar. It's got that vibe.
And you can imagine these if the film was done, these are Geiger is doing the reliefs.
Oh,
right?
yeah, this is Alien. This is Alien 1, absolutely. Guillermo del Toro, who directed both the Hellboy movies, among other things, actually has written the spec script for At the Mountains of Madness.
Oh, really?
I've read it. It's honestly not great. It's more like, it's not really Lovecraftian so much as like a remake of John Carpenter's The Thing. Is kind of
the thing with At the Mountains of Madness,
I love John Carpenter.
Yeah, me too. The thing with At the Mountains of Madness is the ideas are brilliant, but like a lot of Lovecraft things, I don't know how well it translates to film because the plot doesn't contain the plot tropes that a film does, right? It doesn't have, it's just, we're going to Antarctica. We found something crazy. We went in there and that's kind of it. Like,
and we went in and there was something still alive.
And this isn't dismissal. I mean, I think that one in particular I read just recently, it's brilliant, but like, to try and translate that into film, you're sort of like, well, what are the stakes? Why does the audience care about the characters? It's sort of not. A lot of Lovecraft stuff doesn't quite work that way.
Welbeck makes this interesting point that Lovecraft is, in a way, more of his mind works like an architect's mind. He's not really talking about characters and plot points, like you say, Brad. He's creating a world that draws you inward. And I've always thought Lovecraft would be a great theme park designer. Because that's what he's doing. He's creating these worlds where it's like it's taking you to this place of fascination where all you want to do is go in deeper and ride the scary ride. Right. That's what he does.
Right. Yeah, he's like building an experience more than he's telling a story. I mean, it is a story, but you know what I mean. Yeah, for sure. So we've got At the Mountains of Madness, and then there's like one or two other big ones, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of other ones. Yeah, there are three other ones actually that I want to make absolutely sure to hit. The Shadow over Innsmouth. If you read one Lovecraft story out of this, if you're new to Lovecraft and don't have any experience with his fiction, this would be the one I would recommend starting with, just because it's the most like a regular story. It's the only Lovecraft story that has a chase scene, and it's a good chase scene. It's about a man who he's traveling through New England. He takes a shortcut through a bus that goes to this little town called Innsmouth that no one ever goes to because apparently the people there are all degenerate half-breeds and they're gross and nobody likes to mix with them. So again, we have the racial themes from his horror in New York coming in. And the guy goes to Innsmouth and he finds out that it's actually true, that people have these unnaturally wide mouths. They have this weird fish-like skin. They have these bulgy eyes, and they have a church that doesn't actually correspond to any known religion, but nobody will tell anyone what religion it is. And there's this scene where he's locked in his hotel room for the night, and he just hears these sort of squelching and crawling noises all around his hotel room, and it sets off this chase scene through the town in the dead of night. And I think honestly, this is probably the Lovecraft story that would make the best adaptation to a movie. It's the one that has the closest thing to a plot. Mm-hmm. And then this narrator actually does survive and ends up going home and making it home. And then there's a Twilight Zone sort of twist at the end that sort of gets you. It really scared me as a kid. That's 1931, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and then just two more, that I want to make sure to hit. 1932, The Dreams in the Witch House. This is, for my money, the creepiest Cthulhu mythos story of all of them. It's just it's like a David Lynch movie. It's this guy, he's a mathematician. He rents a room in a cottage, again, in New England, in a little town. And the house formerly belonged to a woman who was named Keziah Mason, who was burned as a witch, but she was actually a mathematician who was way ahead of her time. And Lovecraft in this story brings in quantum physics, which was just had barely even been discovered at the time that he was writing this in 1931. He brings in he makes references to Einstein, the theory of relativity. And contrary to some of these earlier stories where you're more dealing with like magical sort of dream-like fantasy themes, this is a story in which he takes mathematics and makes it horrifying. Mathematics are the gateway. Mathematics drive the narrator insane the more he studies them. And the witches, the woman who was burned as a witch, she escaped into some other realm of non-Euclidean space-time through her knowledge of quantum mechanics. And she has a familiar. Every witch has to have a familiar, right? And her familiar is a little creature called Brown Jenkin, and it's a rat with a human face.
Oh God.
And there is a scene in the story where the narrator is sleeping in his bed in the house, and he's been reading about all the history of this house, and he doesn't want to believe it's real. And then he starts hearing something scratching around in the shadows in the room. And he goes, oh my God, it's the thing. It's Brown. And it is just one of the flat out creepiest scenes ever.
That's unsettling.
Brown Jenkin?
Brown Jenkin. Yeah.
That would be a great name for a blues band.
It would be.
Brown Jenkin.
Yeah.
You're right.
But with a theremin.
Right.
Yeah. And then the last really of the key works of this cycle. There are some other great stories in here, by the way. I'm skipping a few, but the last really big one, 1934 or 35, The Shadow Out of Time. So this starts with an economics professor at a university. He's giving a lecture on economics, and he drops dead in like an epileptic faint in the middle of his lecture. They take him to the hospital. He wakes up a few days later, and he has some weird mannerisms. He doesn't quite seem to be himself. He has displays a lack of knowledge about the most basic realities of everyday life. He doesn't know how to use silverware. He has trouble walking, yet he has a sort of sardonic knowledge of the distant past and the distant future, and refers to future events as though he already knows about them, and refers to events from 50, 60 million years ago as if he was intimately familiar. And it transpires that this guy, his consciousness was actually kicked out of his body by the member of a species known as the Great Race. That's the name Lovecraft uses. They existed in around 65 million years ago, the time of the dinosaurs. So again, we have multiple eras, multiple epochs of life on Earth. This is not the race who existed 500 million years ago, who built the city in the Antarctic. This is a different alien race who existed 65 million years ago and built their cities in the tropical jungles of the Jurassic period.
Right.
They sort of look like big cones with these sort of long three-eyed heads on the ends of tentacles. They can project their minds through time, and they are librarians fundamentally. This is where I really feel like the Borgesian theme comes in. They have a library where they kidnap the minds of other beings from all throughout time, all throughout space and time and the galaxy, from every possible period, and they bring them all together, and they're librarians together. They work in this library, and they record histories of their own times, and they talk with one another. And you almost, as horrific as this is being portrayed in the story, you almost feel like this is kind of Lovecraft LARPing a little bit. Like this is kind of, he kind of would like to be there. There's a passage in the story where he talks about like I've conversed with similar to the one that I read earlier from Beyond the Wall of Sleep. He's like I've conversed with an insect philosopher from Jupiter, and a man from an empire 10,000 years in the future, and an astrophysicist from the year 2530, and all these different and it just has this incredible sense of scale. And then
it's like look, Morty, I'm a pickle.
Right.
Morty.
I've had multiple people have compared Lovecraft to Rick and Morty, and I think it is not a bad comparison, actually.
And this story is like the key one, really.
It's like come on, Morty, we're on the other planet, we're in the tentacle alien bodies, we're recording our history of Earth 65 million years ago. I need you to catch up, Morty, come on.
Right.
So that's where Lovecraft takes you. And then of course these creatures are terrified of an even more scary race of beings who are on the Earth even longer and live in these black subterranean tunnels, and then the the climax of the story is that the narrator actually goes to find the ruins of the actual city, which still exist now they're in the wilderness of Australia. And there's a twist at the end, which is that he excavates the ruins and he finds something that confirms he's been sort of hoping throughout the whole story that this whole thing was just some sort of a wild dream or something. But once he gets back to his own body, he goes to the ruins in Australia, digs up the place that he remembers, and finds things that prove to him that he actually was there in that alien body 65 million years ago.
Right. No, that's that one. That's another one that I hadn't read before, that I read as part of the preparation for this, and was impressed by it for sure. That's an amazing overview of Lovecraft's.
Push it to the limit.
Yeah.
We're going to the limit.
It's not even everything he wrote in this period, but that was great. Yeah. I want to kind of, because we're going kind of long. We're in Kubrick territory, which is fine. I want to kind of talk about the last, whatever, say 1926. Lovecraft dies in 1937. So we're not talking about a lot more life here, but there are some kind of things that we've planted about him that I kind of want to sort of round out in these later years. The period after, so much like his period after high school, his period after his mother dying, there's a period after Sonia leaves where he kind of withdraws. He comes out of it, and this is rough approximations in time, but it's about right. He comes out of it with Call of Cthulhu and this amazing run of work that Ben has laid out so beautifully, and you've got this stuff down. That was really impressive.
I've been reading and reading. See, the funny thing about how horrific and terrible and nihilistic this mythos is, I'm kind of powerless to explain why, but it's fun to read. It rewards rereading. It's like, and I don't know why it's a world that you want to spend time in, but it is.
Yeah. So I want to kind of give you a sense of what he's like sort of at the end, right? Because we painted him as this racist and this kind of uptight person who was dependent on other people, kind of ineffectual, and he's maturing. The way I think of him is he's like 15 or 20 years behind in maturity. So by the time he hits 40, in some ways he's as mature as like a 20-year-old might be. In some ways, and in other ways, he's a fully grown man. The racism thing, I think, is kind of interesting. Like I said, every time he would encounter another group of people in a real way, he would he would soften that edge. So he travels to Quebec, and he's enamored of Quebec. He the French Canadians, who he thought of as just another group like any other that wasn't a good old white Protestant American. They're redeemed in his eyes. He in fact writes a 75,000 word travel log about Quebec that includes maps and everything else. He could have probably sold it if he would have taken the time to make it, put it in a proper form and actually do that. He did favor Hitler. I don't know why I'm laughing about.
Why are we laughing about this?
but there's something, because it's so dramatic. It's like what. So he does favor Hitler. Here was the appeal to try and understand what the very reactionary tendency, the reactionary appeal of a fascist and fascism might be for somebody like Lovecraft. You're talking again about somebody who thinks they belong in the 18th century, who thinks and thereby thinks that society is undergoing decadence, is degrading, and that a fascist might be able to keep that process from happening. I think that's the most generous take you can have on somebody who might have might have a leaning towards fascism.
And super important to remember too that Hitler at the time he duped a lot of people.
Yeah, no, right. He duped an entire country, right?
Yeah, right.
And in fact, one of the things that tamped Lovecraft's sort of favoritism for Hitler. He had negative things to say about him. He sort of spoke about both sides of his mouth about Hitler, or at least early on. One thing that happened was for a time, Lovecraft lived with a woman who was a Germanophile who would go to Germany in 1935, 1936, I believe, and would come back and tell Lovecraft these horrible stories about how Jews were being treated, and she was completely disillusioned by Germany entirely. And so that was one thing that kind of made him think twice. Another thing was a book came out, or he read a book in 1935 called The Science of Life by H.G. Wells, which was somebody who he respected, and Julian Huxley, which debunked the whole Aryan myth, which was what a lot of Lovecraft's racism was based on. He thought he was being scientific. Again, this is not excusing it, but you're thinking about what are your influences. You know, he had read a book that told him Aryans were the greatest race of all time, and sort of bought it hook, line, and sinker because it played into his own feelings of inadequacy, right? And again, I'm trying to paint a picture of a person whose perspective evolved over time, and then maybe it didn't end where we would like it to end, but it isn't necessarily the same person who wrote all those terrible things about people he saw in the East Side slums, right? It changes. He eventually gives up, his quote unquote Judeophobia. In a letter, basically says something along the lines of, "We've all got to live together." Let me read that real quick, because it is one of the later things he says on this sort of topic, and I think it's important that if we're going to call him a racist and all of these things, we should at least give him maybe the final say on this. The general Jewish question. This is from a letter of his, and again, I'm not saying I agree with any of this, right? This is trying to understand who this guy was and how his mind worked. The general Jewish question has its perplexing cultural aspects, but the biologically unsound Nazi attitude offers no solution. What is more, it is equally silly to belittle even the admittedly hybrid art of Judeo-Germans or Judeo-Americans. It may not represent genuine German or American feeling, but at least it has a right to stand. But it at least has a right to stand on its own feet as a frankly exotic or composite product, which may well excel much of our own art in intrinsic quality. Still more, it is equally silly to insist that the mere element of blood, as distinguished from culture, makes art necessarily hybrid. Almost any line of solution is better than the arbitrary and unscientific ones the Nazis have chosen. Right? So that's, to me, that in and of itself, it's still a little problematic. but it's not Hitler was right. Right? It's decidedly not. Hitler was right. The Aryan race should reign supreme. We should gas the foreigners. It's definitely not in that mind frame anymore. And so I just kind of want to make sure we get that in with the rest of this stuff, I suppose.
Yeah, it's tough because to this day, the weird fiction community continues to struggle with how do we parse, what do we do with H.P. Lovecraft? Because obviously you can't write, there is no such thing as weird fiction without H.P. Lovecraft, right? Anybody that says that they work in this genre without being influenced by Lovecraft is lying, because his influence is either direct or indirect. Yeah, he's too pervasive. And yet as a human being, he's so problematic, even with some of the mitigating remarks that he made later in life. He did write the N-word poem. He did have a cat named N-word man. He wrote letters in support of Hitler. And these are facts. And so this is something that the community continues to struggle with. I would say that at the conventions that I've been to, the attitude tends to be that talking about Lovecraft is kind of canceled. Like, people just don't really want to talk about him, which I don't really feel like is a great solution either, because he's there. I mean, what do you, it's like hard to talk about sci-fi without talking about Asimov. Like, what do you do? So this is something that continues to be struggled with.
Right. And then are you really, okay, so yeah, are you really dealing with, well, see, the part that's tricky to me too is that it's so, to me, there's his attitudes was leaking into sort of the cosmology that he was writing in, right? And Absolutely. So if you're going to be like, well, it's not that, he coincidentally was also racist.
Right.
It's in the stories themselves. This cosmic xenophobia goes along with his very everyday Providence, Rhode Island xenophobia.
Absolutely, and this is one of the things that the weird fiction community continues to struggle with. Is right, exactly. It's as you said. It's not just that Lovecraft was super influential. It's would we even have weird fiction as we know it today if Lovecraft hadn't been a racist?
Right.
And that's that's a really, really tricky question to wrestle with. We all like reading about the tentacled monsters who come down into the rural New England communities to breed with people and produce unnatural progeny, and we like playing the RPGs about it. We don't like talking about the fact that this came out of the fact that Lovecraft really hated black people.
Right.
So it's what do we do with that? And there is no easy answer.
No,
there really
isn't.
Sure.
Yeah.
He may be the most American figure that we've done in terms of just how extreme and contradictory and of his time, he was. We forget that, was it Wilson that screened Birth of a Nation at the White House?
I think that's right.
And I do think it is a fault of a community. And Ben, I don't lurk on the threshold of these circles you're describing, so to speak, short of doing the podcast. But you do have to wrestle with this stuff, and you ought to think about it, and you ought to think about the milieu that he came out of and the period, and try to put it in a box, try to understand it, and wrestle with the whole picture of the thing. And of course, disavow the worst of it. Yeah. What else are you going to do? But not talking about it,
it's not an answer. Yeah.
No, it's not an answer. It's not. So hopefully this podcast has done a little bit of that and maybe opened up some people's minds to a little bit of this. Yeah, go on, Brad.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. It's something that I kind of wrestled with when I was starting to put these notes together. I was like, how am I going to talk about this? Like, how do you present this in a way? These things are so sensitive now that there is like you were saying, Ben, talking about Lovecraft is canceled. Like, there is a sense in which even without even stating an opinion, these can be dangerous things to talk about.
Well, they're already in the process of trying to rewrite the Harry Potter universe without there's a faction in that fandom that's rewriting it without her because she's being canceled. It's all coming so fast. But I do wonder, do we have enough distance from Lovecraft? There's a little more time, and he's such an oddball and so far out. I just cannot imagine ever going on a date with a man, ever marrying the man. What a character.
Well, now
at the end of the DeCamp bio that Brad was quoting from earlier, L. Sprague DeCamp actually says at the end of the book, he says, "I do not pretend to understand Hp Lovecraft." So even his biographer throws up his hands.
I don't know. Yeah. That's what he was. That's what he did.
You know who does? Reddit.
Reddit gets
we gotta take it to Reddit.
Reddit, everybody on Reddit is like, man,
they're like, these guys don't know what they're talking about. I understand Hp Lovecraft. I have the unique insights into this singular mind.
So let me give, because we are kind of going long, and I think it's good. It's been great. We've hit the major biographical points. We're going to kind of wind down because we've kind of talked about the majority of his work, and I think we've painted who he is and the arc. But I also kind of want to land Lovecraft a little bit because he'd had so much, pain. I don't even know if it's pain, but he'd had so much withdrawal and so much as being coddled first and then withdrawing himself. In his later life, he would start to travel. Starting in 1928, he would travel to see friends in Massachusetts, in New York City. He would eventually wander kind of down south to Georgia and Florida. And he became something of an expert traveler in his very sort of, very attention to detail kind of way. He would know all of the bus routes, and he would know how to do it as cheap as possible and where to stay and what to do to live on as few dollars as he could to stretch out the time as much as possible. We have to imagine, just as we imagine Lovecraft in a heavy robes to keep himself warm in an old creaky house in Providence by himself, pale, with a bathtub full of empty candy containers, which a visitor once said he had. As much as we have to imagine him as that, we also need to imagine Lovecraft with a straw hat, sitting down out in the sun in Florida as a 45-year-old man. You know, we gotta keep both of these things in mind. The last episode, Kevin, that we did, we talked a little bit about a late friendship that he developed with Robert Barlow, which I find is fascinating. Robert Barlow is this like 13 or 14-year-old kid who starts writing Lovecraft, who's a man in his 40s. And they develop a correspondence, friendship. And Barlow ends up inviting Lovecraft down, whereupon Lovecraft discovers that it's a 14-year-old boy. Whether he knew it beforehand is not entirely clear. It's not 100% sure that Lovecraft knew it before, but he might have. He goes and he stays out in the boonies of Florida with Robert Barlow and Robert Barlow's father for a fairly extended period of time. And they develop a lifelong relationship that lasts the rest of Lovecraft's life. Robert Barlow is even his literary executor before it's handed off to is it August Derleth? What's
August Derleth gets his hands on Lovecraft's estate. Lovecraft didn't leave his estate to Derleth, as I'm sure you're probably about to say.
Right. Yeah. So Barlow was supposed to be and I think Barlow kind of dropped the ball and maybe didn't really want to, and he wouldn't have been the champion that Derleth was anyway, because Robert Barlow ran off to Mexico, and 10 years later, you know, took a bunch of Seconal and killed himself, so he wouldn't get outed as a homosexual. There's a lot of, almost everybody that Lovecraft runs into would be an interesting subject for an episode. Robert Barlow would be an interesting subject for an episode on here. Robert E. Howard would be a fascinating subject on here. 1936, Robert Barlow's mother falls into a terminal coma from cancer, and he kills himself at the age of 30 after inventing Conan the Barbarian, you know, which is not even Conan the Barbarian, Conan, that in that world, which is a comparable development of a mythos. If he'd been given 10 more years, he could have built that into something even larger than it already was, and it's still, you know, it's a huge looming artistic production. And so we reach this point where Lovecraft doesn't quite get the credit maybe he deserved, but he does get some credit. People know who he is. He's a you know, Weird Tales all-star. He's getting approached for book deals, though it never quite works out.
He did have a novel in the works, by the way. He wanted to do like a Faulkner-esque family saga about a family of witches and warlocks who live in this old New England farmhouse and have contact with the entities from outside. And so it's fascinating to wonder what that would have become.
It's so metal. It's so heavy metal. I love it.
It is. Yeah. I'm going to give you, so, and then in 1936, we'll give a quick kind of byline on this. And then I want to give you one letter that tells you what Lovecraft thought of his own writing career and things kind of at the end. Late 1936, he starts feeling ill. Into 1937, it turns out that he gets diagnosed of stomach cancer, March 2nd of 1937. He's already in severe pain. One of his aunts has preceded him in death by several years. I think the other one is still alive, I believe. And he very quickly, from March 2nd, I think he dies on March 15th in a hospital in an incredible amount of pain. Though, you know, by all accounts, he was still a gentleman with the nurses to the very end. Stoical about the physical pain, and you know, passes on at age 46. Which is pretty remarkably young, I would say.
That is a lot younger than I would have anticipated. And yet it kind of makes sense given the nature of his body of work, where there's no fully realized novel. I'm surprised and not surprised that he passed away that young.
Also, the money in his inheritance account, it's like his physical body, his inheritance money,
that's a good
and
point.
His body of work all like run out at almost exactly the same time. Hp Lovecraft is done with Earth.
Right. That is exactly why you need to support the show at patreon.com/artofdarkpod, where we're going to talk on the After Dark episode for this with the great Ben Thomas, who's done a wonderful job. We're going to talk about is Cthulhu real? But I'm going to let Brad stick the landing.
Yeah. So let me read this one story. This is this one letter, and then we'll kind of close it. This is Lovecraft wrote to a woman named Helen Sully, who is another writer. In actual fact, there are few total losses and never wases which discourage and exasperate me more than the venerable HPL. I know a few persons, and this is him writing about himself. I know a few persons whose attainments fall more consistently short of their aspirations, or who in general have less to live for. Every aptitude which I wish I had, I lack. Everything which I wish I could formulate and express, I have failed to formulate and express. Everything which I value, I have either lost or am likely to lose. Within a decade, unless I can find some job paying at least $10 per week, I shall have to take the cyanide route through inability to keep around me the books, pictures, furniture, and other familiar objects which constitute my only remaining reason for keeping alive. And so far as solitude is concerned, I probably capture all metals. In Providence, I've never seen a congenial mind with which I could exchange ideas, and even among my correspondents, there are fewer and fewer who coincide with me on enough points to make discourse enjoyable on a few specialized points. The newer generation has grown away from me, whilst the older is so fossilized as to form very meager material for argument or conversation. In everything, philosophy, politics, aesthetics, and interpretation of the sciences, I find myself alone on an island, with an atmosphere almost of hostility gathering around me. With youth, all the possibilities of glamour and adventurous expectancy departed, leaving me stranded on a shelf with nothing to look forward to. The reason I've been more melancholy than usual in the last few years is that I am coming to distrust more and more of the value of the material I produce. Adverse criticism has of late vastly undermined my confidence in my literary powers. That was right near the end. I think that was 1936 he wrote that letter, 1937, spring. He passes on. And so left kind of thinking, well, yeah, some people like my work. I never really managed to pull off what I wanted to pull off. I don't really, I feel alienated still, I feel like now he's old, right? And at some point you're all potential. And by the time you're 46, some of that potential has either been actualized or used up, and he didn't really understand what he'd actually accomplished.
I think it's worth noting that Hp Lovecraft would not actually see print in an actual book until after his death. That was when August Derleth started Arkham House Press, published a collection called The Outsider and Others, which was the first hardcover anthology of Hp Lovecraft's work. And he'd later be taken up, oddly enough, as a flagship author by the hippie community, alongside Tolkien and Herbert, which obviously Lovecraft would not have been a big fan of that. Died thinking that he probably would never be known beyond pulp magazines.
Right.
Well, there's a lot more synergy between the hippies and the fascists than I think the hippies would like to admit. Let's be real. But that's a topic for another podcast.
That's right. So yeah, I think
I am.
Go ahead.
No, I am just going to applaud you boys for. Woo!
Thanks. Yeah.
That was a
lot. And we had some more we could go into, but I think that
we're going to do it on the.
We could have done more than this, actually.
Yes, we're going to have a Patreon episode. I think that we do end with a question too, don't we, Brad?
Yeah. Yes, we do. What is Lovecraft doing now? I think we tossed this to Ben. If Lovecraft was alive now, what would he be doing?
What would he be doing? I think he would absolutely be spurning and shunning all things digital media. I think he would have no interest in any of the communities that have taken up his work. Heavy metal, anything countercultural, he would absolutely be disgusted by. I think probably he would still be living in Providence, and I think he might have written his novel. He certainly probably have written more short stories, and being very solicitous to people who came to see him in person. I think not a bad analog is what happened with Alan Moore. Alan Moore was a very successful graphic novelist throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s. There's a bunch of movies based on his work, all of which Alan Moore absolutely hated. And Alan Moore retired back to his hometown in England. He still lives there. He teaches small literature classes, goes for his daily walks with a circle of friends. From what I've heard, if you go and see him in person, he's perfectly friendly, but will have no dealings with the social media sphere Hollywood, the film industry, none of it. He just wants to live in his little cottage in the countryside and be a writer and have his quiet little life. And I think
good for him.
Isn't he also a practicing magician though?
He is.
He is.
Like a
he is a practicing wizard. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And a huge Lovecraft fan. And I think honestly, I think that's where we'd find Lovecraft. I think we'd find him at his little house in Providence, just scribbling away.
And let's go on the record here. This podcast is friends of people from Rhode Island. We're friends of people from Cleveland. We're giant friends of the Italians, and we're massive friends with the Wizards.
We are.
Yes.
You really don't want to go against the Wizards.
Never.
No,
it would be a terrible idea. Ben, can you get your plugs in? Tell people where they can find you. And I want to thank you so much, and Brad, for organizing this. A lot of work goes into these episodes. We really do earnestly look for your support. We look for it through Patreon, but also through our website at artofdarkpod.com. Ben, where can people find you?
Top place you want to go, houseblackwood.net. My 2 books, The Cradle and the Sword and Tales from Omnipark. Those are both on Amazon. And the Willows Anthology, you can find at willowsmagazine.com. Recommend checking all of them out.
Love it. Brad, we're gonna go another 30 minutes, maybe another 45 minutes. At this rate, this is a banger. We're gonna go, and I really do want to hear your thinking on, is Cthulhu real? And I have a feeling we're gonna go a little deeper into Lovecraft. I have a hunch that there are a few things maybe y'all left out. So
that's again, for the Patreon folks. Yes,
that's it.
Patreon.com/artofdarkpod.
Yes, and again, Viva Italia. Just trying to cover my bases.
I hear you.
This guy is like, hot.
I'm going to stand up and stretch really quick.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yep. See you, boys. Yeah.